She was the only woman on the mountain, and every man behind her wanted her gone. 6 elite operators. 1 impossible target. 1,000 meters of wind-torn canyon between the rifle and the kill. Staff Sergeant Maya Voss had been laughed at when she unzipped the case. She'd been told twice, to her face, that she didn't belong here. That this wasn't a classroom. That real precision shooting under combat stress was a different animal than anything she'd ever touched. Then the radio crackled. 1 target, 1 window, 3 seconds. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She fired, and 6 men stopped breathing. If you're new here, subscribe now and hit that bell. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. You don't want to miss what comes next. The helicopter dropped them at 310 hours into nothing. No lights, no landmarks. Just the brutal cold of Kandahar province, biting through 4 layers of gear, and a ridgeline that disappeared into a sky full of stars that felt too far away to mean anything. Maya Voss stepped off the skid last, the way she always did, not because anyone told her to, but because somebody had to watch the rear, and the 6 men ahead of her weren't going to do it. Carried the Mk-21 PSR in a drag bag across her back, the rifle broken down but ready to be assembled in under 90 seconds. That was her record. She'd done it in '83 once, on a cold morning in Montana with numb fingers and her father watching from behind a thermos of black coffee, not saying a word, just nodding when she finished. Her father had a way of nodding that meant more than most people's speeches. The LZ was a flat shelf of gravel and frozen shrub about 40 meters wide, carved into the southern face of a mountain that didn't have a name on any map she'd been given. The insertion point was picked for concealment, not comfort. There was a 600-meter elevation gain to the overwatch position, and they had 3 hours before first light made movement dangerous. Captain Elias Ward was already moving. He didn't wait for everyone to get their bearings. He just went long legs, eating up the rocky incline in a pace that was deliberately punishing. The kind of pace designed to string out a column and identify weak links early. Maya kept up without effort. Behind her, she heard Chief Petty Officer Dede Kowalski muttering something under his breath. Probably about the cold, probably about altitude, possibly about her. Probably about her. She'd heard it from the moment Ward's orders came through 3 days ago. Shadow Tide was not accustomed to additions. The unit had 7 operators, a core structure that had functioned through 4 rotations in country, and a team culture that was impermeable to outsiders by design. They trusted each other, the way soldiers trust people they've almost died beside, which is to say, completely and defensively at the same time. Maya was not one of those people. She'd been called to Colonel Hargrove's office on a Tuesday afternoon. No warning, no context, just a summons and a manila folder that she was handed without preamble. Shadow Tide is running a precision interdict in Kandahar province in 72 hours, Hargrove had said. He was a large man whose voice had been stripped of most of its register by 30 years of cold weather and stress. Their original precision shooter tore his CL on an obstacle course yesterday. You're replacing him. Maya had looked at the folder without opening it. Shadow Tide specifically requested me. Shadow Tide specifically requested a precision specialist with a qualifying score above 98 and the psychological profile to function under extreme isolation conditions. A pause. You were the only name that cleared both filters. She'd opened the folder then. The target package was thin, a high-value facilitator named Azad Karimi, who was moving through the Kandahar Valley system with predictable routing, hitting a specific compound for resupply on a cycle that intelligence had been tracking for 8 weeks. The window to interdict was narrow. The terrain was brutal. The shot, based on the preliminary site survey, would be between 900 and 1,100 meters, depending on where Karimi presented. What's Ward been told about me? Maya asked. Hargrove's expression didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. He's been told you're qualified, Hargrove said. What he chooses to do with that information is between him and his conscience. The insertion went clean. No contact, no compromise, no indication that anyone on the ground knew they were there. Ward set a pace that was close to brutal for the terrain and the altitude, but the team absorbed it without complaint. These were men who'd spent careers reducing their physical limits to abstract numbers on assessment forms. Pain was a data point. Fatigue was a variable to be managed. Maya had grown up in elevation. Her father's land in eastern Montana sat above 5,000 feet, and she'd been hunting game at altitude since she was 11 years old. The thin air of Kandahar province was uncomfortable, but it wasn't hostile. She tracked Ward's movement and matched it, keeping a 20-meter gap, eyes squeezing above and right. Nobody spoke during the climb. Ward didn't allow calm chatter during movement, a discipline she approved of, even if she'd had nothing to do with establishing it. They were 40 minutes out from the LZ when Kowalski pulled up beside her. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from local stone, and he moved efficiently despite his size. He was the team's primary breacher, and he'd been on 3 rotations with Shadow Tide. She knew his file. She doubted he knew hers. "You need to adjust your drag bag," he said. Not a question. Maya glanced at him without breaking stride. "Fine. Left strap's twisted. You'll feel it in your shoulder by the time we hit the ridgeline." She didn't look down. She kept moving. "I adjusted it at the LZ." "You adjusted the right strap." 3 seconds of silence. She rolled her left shoulder once, feeling the faint dig of a misaligned buckle against her trapezius. She'd missed it. She said nothing, reached back with one hand, without breaking stride, and fixed it. Kowalski dropped back. She didn't thank him. He didn't seem to expect it. The overwatch position was a natural shelf on the north face of the ridgeline, partially concealed by a lip of eroded rock that created a forward depression roughly 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep. It was almost perfect. Whoever had done the site survey had good instincts. The position offered 300 degrees of observation, a clean line to the valley floor, and a natural escape route that ran north through a boulder field. Ward halted the team at 508 hours. First light was 47 minutes out. Crouched in the center of the position, spreading the terrain map across his knee and clicking his red-filtered torch twice. Team gathered. Maya set her drag bag down and began assembling the MK-21 without looking at it, her hands moving from memory while her eyes stayed on Ward's briefing. "This is where we sit until the window opens," Ward said. His voice was low and flat, the voice of someone who'd given 1,000 pre-op briefs and stopped performing them years ago. Intel puts Karimi's vehicle convoy, arriving at the compound between 900 and 1,100. Once he's confirmed inside, we have approximately 20 minutes before. The pattern of life at the compound changes, and the window closes. He looked around the group, not at anyone in particular, just around. Questions. It wasn't really a question. It was an invitation to stay silent, and the team accepted it. Then Sergeant First Class Brennan Hayes, the assistant team leader, a lean red-haired man from somewhere in New England, who wore his skepticism like a second uniform, looked directly at Maya. "What's your longest confirmed shot?" The assembly of the MK-21 was complete. Maya set the rifle down in the depression and looked back at Hayes. 847 meters. In training? In Montana. Mule deer at 847 meters in a 32-kilometer crosswind. She let that sit for a moment. The deer was not a training target. Hayes's expression was the kind that meant he was recalculating something without admitting he'd been wrong to start. "This shot is over 1,000 meters, he said. "I'm aware. You've never taken a combat shot. Neither had your current long gun until his first deployment." Ward looked up from the map, not at Hayes, at her. "Confirmed range to target, based on this morning's laser, is 1,060 meters, he said. The valley funnels wind from the southwest between 800 and 1,200. Your spotter is Reyes. He knows the terrain and the wind patterns in this valley from 2 prior deployments. A pause. Questions. Maya met Ward's eyes. She had several questions. She asked none of them. No, sir. Good. Ward folded the map. Everybody rest. 2-hour rotation on the scope. Corporal Jesse Reyes was 26 years old and had the particular kind of stillness that belonged to people who'd spent a long time in hides. He set up the spotting scope of Vectronics, PLRF, at the left edge of the depression without settled in beside it, with the practiced ease of someone doing something for the 1,000th time. Maya lay down behind the MK-21. They worked through a ranging sequence for 40 minutes, building a data card. Reyes called distances, angle of declination, and observed wind indicators at multiple points along the valley dust movement, heat shimmer patterns, the behavior of a sparse vegetation on the compound walls. Maya built her firing solution in her head and double-checked it with the Kestrel weather meter. She noted the altitude correction. She noted the density altitude. She noted the way the wind was behaving at 3 different elevation bands between her position in the target compound and the way those bands interacted. The shot wasn't clean. It never was at this distance. At 1,000 meters, a bullet doesn't travel in a straight line. Travels in an arc that curves with gravity, drifts with wind, and decelerates in ways that require you to think 4 seconds into the future and aim at a point in space where your target will be, not where they are. You aren't shooting at a person. You're making a prediction and then committing to it with violence. Her father had explained it to her when she was 13, lying in the dirt on a Montana hillside with a 0.308 she could barely manage the weight of. You're not aiming at what you see, Maisie. You're aiming at what's going to be. Thought it sounded like something from a fortune cookie. Then she'd made a 700-meter shot on a steel plate in a 20-mile-an-hour wind at age 14. And she'd understood that some things that sound simple are simple, and the complication is in the doing. By 745, the team was on full alert. A vehicle had been spotted on the Valley Road, confirmed via the team's Orover terminal as consistent with Karimi's convoy profile. 2 technical trucks, 1 sedan. Dust pattern suggested the vehicles were moving at roughly 30 kilometers per hour. Ward keyed his radio. Overwatch, this is actual. We have confirmed vehicle movement on the primary approach vector. Stand by to confirm. Maya pressed the earpiece tighter. Overwatch copies. Standing by. She'd been on the scope for 90 minutes without a break. Her right eye was steady. Her breathing was in a slow 4 count that she'd been maintaining since dawn. The world had compressed to a circle of high magnification glass, and everything outside it had become irrelevant information. Reyes had his eye to the spotting scope. The convoy slowing on the east approach. Range to the compound gate, 1047 meters. Wind is out of the southwest at 14, gusting to 19. Gusts are irregular, averaging about 8 seconds between peaks. Copy. I'll call the gust cycle. You shoot in the lull. Understood. Silence. The convoy stopped at the compound gate. 3 minutes of administrative activity guards checking credentials, vehicle inspections, the kind of procedural that looks like security, but is mostly habit. Then the gate opened. Then the radio crackled. Again, Ward's voice tighter than it had been. Overwatch, we have a visual on the primary target. He's outside the vehicles. He's standing at the gate. We have a 30-second window before he moves inside. 30 seconds. Maya had the scope on him. A man in a tan field jacket, medium build, standing with one hand on the gate frame. Couldn't see his face clearly at this range, but she didn't need to. Reyes had the visual confirmation from the spotting scope and the biometric comparison from the Orover terminal. Positive ID on actual target, Reyes said. There was no emotion in his voice. Just information. He's presenting. No obstruction. Wind, Maya said. 14 out of the southwest. Gust cycle standby. A pause of several seconds. Lull in 3, 2, 1. She exhaled half a breath. Stopped exhaling. She squeezed. The Mk-21 thundered. The muzzle brake vented gas sideways. The recoil was there, and then it was gone. Absorbed, managed, and she was already cycling the bolt and settling back into the scope. 1,047 meters away, Azad Karimi stopped standing. 4 seconds of nothing. Then Ward's voice, barely controlled. Overwatch, confirm effect on target. Target is down, Reyes said. His voice hadn't changed at all. No movement. Hit is confirmed. Below in the valley, the compound erupted into noise that was too distant to hear but visible through the scope as a sudden scattering of figures. Vehicles beginning to move, the whole organism of the enemy position, going from pattern of life to contact response in the space of a few heartbeats. Maya stayed on the scope. Movement on the northwest rooftop, she said. Rifleman bearing 345, elevation, Delta plus 12. She had him in the glass before she finished the sentence. A man on a flat rooftop with a PKM machine gun, swinging the barrel toward the hillside, not toward her position specifically, but toward the ridgeline in general. A sector sweep, looking for what he couldn't find. But in 10 seconds, he would have the assault team's approach vector. Ward's voice, Overwatch, we have no eyes on the northwest rooftop. Confirm hostile? Confirmed hostile. Confirmed weapon system. He's about to find your approach vector. She was already making the correction. New range Reyes was calling it 912 meters to the rooftop. Position, angle, different wind condition at the compound's elevation versus the valley floor. She had maybe 6 seconds before the PKM crew found something to shoot at. Reyes. Wind at the compound level is lower 8 to 10, same bearing. No gust cycle, it's steady. He was reading her mind. You're good. She fired without Ward's authorization. The second shot crossed the valley in just over a second. The man with the PKM sat down against the parapet wall and didn't get back up. Total time between the first shot and the second, 11 seconds. Ward's voice came back on the radio, and this time there was something different in it. Not warmth, not gratitude, just the flat, careful tone of a man who was revising a judgment he'd already made. Overwatch, both targets confirmed down. Assault element is moving. Hold your position. Maya cycled the bolt on the Mk-21 and kept her eye on the scope. Reyes, without looking up from the spotting scope, said, good shot. Just 2 words, delivered into the dirt in front of him. To nobody in particular, the way a man says something he means, but doesn't want to make a whole thing about. Wind red was solid, Maya said. It was. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. They both kept watching the compound. The assault element hit the compound at 947 hours. Maya and Reyes tracked the action from the Overwatch position, a disorienting experience watching a firefight at range through magnification, seeing the muzzle flashes and movement without hearing most of it until the sound caught up. Seconds later, fragmented and out of sync. CQB looked different from 1,000 meters. It looked like people moving in patterns that were either aggressive or defensive, and the difference was subtle enough that it required experience to read. She'd done the training. She'd never watched it from this angle. There was a brief, sharp exchange of fire at the eastern entrance, 3 to 4 seconds. Then silence. Then movement toward the interior courtyard. Then another burst of fire, shorter, and then nothing. Assault element. This is Overwatch, Maya keyed. I have 2 individuals moving north through the vehicle yard, bearing 015 from the main gate. They're heading for the back wall. Ward's voice. Copy. We have them. A pause. Negative. We do not have them. Talk me onto them. She talked him onto them. Gave him range, bearing, pace. Direction of travel. Obstacle profile. The 2 runners hit the north wall of the compound and stopped. Looking for a way over. They're at the wall, she said. Got about 40 seconds before they clear it. Below, 2 figures in kit peeled off from the main element, and moved at a sprint. The runners didn't make it over the wall. By 1043, Ward called the objective secure. HVT package confirmed. Sensitive site exploitation underway. All assault element personnel accounted for. Maya pulled back from the scope for the first time in nearly 3 hours. Her neck ached. Her right eye was slightly blurred from the ocular pressure of extended glass time. She had a headache building behind her left temple that she was going to ignore until it went away. She began disassembling the Mk-21. Reyes stood and stretched, joints audible in the cold morning air. He looked at her for a moment, just looked, without the complicated overlay of judgment that had been on everyone else's face for the last 72 hours, and then he looked away toward the valley. You knew that second shooter was going to find the approach vector, he said. Yes, Ward didn't authorize the shot. No, he didn't. The wind had shifted and was coming from the north now, colder, carrying the smell of dust and something vaguely metallic. You going to catch hell for that? Maya fitted the rifle into the drag bag. Probably. Was it the right call? She thought about that for a moment. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to be honest about why she knew it. He had 6 seconds before he acquired the approach vector, she said. Ward had no eyes on the rooftop. The radio loop would have taken 4 seconds minimum to get authorization back to me, and then I still needed the shot itself. She sealed the drag bag. There was no version where I ask first, and the PKM crew doesn't find the team. Reyes nodded, slowly, the nod of a man who had thought through the same problem and arrived at the same place. Ward's going to say you broke protocol. Yes, and you're going to say the team is alive. Another pause. How do you think that conversation goes? Maya shouldered the drag bag and looked at the valley below, where the assault element was beginning its exfil sequence, moving in a tight column back toward the secondary, LZ, carrying everything that needed to come with them, and nothing that didn't. I think it goes the way it goes, she said. She turned away from the valley and started moving toward the exfil route. Behind her, Reyes picked up the spotting scope and followed. The helicopter ride back to forward operating base. Kestrel took 41 minutes. Nobody spoke. Ward sat across from Maya in the cargo bay, and she could feel him thinking. The man had 2 modes that she'd observed: action mode, which was efficient and economical and almost mechanical, and processing mode, which looked like stillness but wasn't. He was in processing mode now. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his eyes weren't quite focused on anything. Kowalski was asleep in 30 seconds, which was a talent she respected. Hayes was cleaning his weapon with the particular focus of a man who was deliberately not making eye contact with someone. She didn't try to start a conversation. She said everything she needed to say to Reyes on the ridgeline, and whatever came next would happen in a debrief room under fluorescent lights, not in a helicopter over Kandar province. She looked out the window at the mountains below. They were beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they're indifferent to you, massive and geometric and completely unconcerned with anything that happened on or between them. Her father would have liked them. She thought about the night he'd taken her out onto the back porch of the ranch house and told her that some things in life would only make sense when you were in them. And the best you could do was prepare so thoroughly that when you got there, your body already knew the answer, even if your mind was still working it out. She'd been 15. She'd thought he was being obtuse. She thought about it differently now. The helicopter banked south and the mountains disappeared from the window, and she turned back to the cargo bay and found that Ward was looking at her, not with suspicion. Not with the particular brand of measured dismissal she'd been getting for 3 days. Something else. Something she couldn't quite put a name to. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he looked away. She filed that away and closed her eyes. The debrief began at 1,330 hours, in a room that smelled like burnt coffee and old cigarette smoke, even though nobody had smoked inside the Faux B in years. Colonel Hargrove was present, via secure video link. Shadow Tide's intelligence officer, a thin woman named Captain Claire Lund, ran the session with a notepad and a recorder. They went through the mission in sequence. Vehicle approach, target confirmation. First shot, immediate post-shot environment. Second shot, assault element support, runners, objective secure. When they got to the second shot, Lund paused. Sergeant Voss, for the record, you fired without direct authorization from actual. Walk me through your decision process. Maya walked her through it, precise, detailed, with times and angles and radio loop calculations that she'd done in real time. She didn't editorialize. She didn't apologize. She laid it out as a sequence of tactical realities and let the math speak for itself. When she finished, there was a silence. Then Ward, who had been listening with his hands folded on the table and his expression giving nothing away, said, "The shot was clean, and it was timely, and it kept my element from getting cut up on the approach." He paused. Protocol violation is real. The outcome justifies the judgment call. I'm logging it as within the scope of independent action doctrine for precision overwatch roles. Lund made a note. Hargrove, on the screen, said nothing for a moment. Then, "Good work, Sergeant Voss." She nodded once. She didn't smile. She didn't thank him. Ward was watching her again, with that expression she couldn't name. The debrief continued. Later, after Lund had released everyone and Hargrove had signed off the video link, Ward appeared in the corridor outside the debrief room. He didn't wait for her to acknowledge him. The way people do when they have flung cider, the way people do when they have something to say and haven't decided exactly how to say it yet. "Your file is thin," he said. "I know. Red Valley lists you as a tactical firearms instructor with an exceptional qualification score. That's it. No combat history. No special assignment notation." He paused. "Most people with a qualification score in the 99th percentile have a file that reflects it." Maya said nothing. Hargrove was specifically directed to send you. Not recommend you. Direct. She kept walking. "I'm not asking for an explanation," Ward said. "I'm telling you what I noticed." He stopped in the corridor and she stopped with him. He looked at her with the direct, undecorated attention of a man who was used to making fast assessments of people and was making one now. "Who taught you to read wind that well?" The question surprised her. Not what she'd expected. "My father," she said. "Who was he?" Pause, long enough to be noticed. "A rancher," she said, "who was also a very good long-distance shooter." Ward looked at her for another moment. The expression she couldn't name had shifted slightly, moved into something adjacent to it that she also couldn't name. "All right," he said. He turned and walked away down the corridor. She watched him go. There was something in the way he'd said "all right." Not satisfied, not dismissive. More like the sound of a door being deliberately left open. Turned the other direction and walked back toward her bunk. Outside, the Condor Mountains were catching the late afternoon sun, and somewhere in the valley below the FOB, a convoy that wasn't carrying Azad Karimi was moving along a road that was now slightly safer than it had been this morning. She'd remember that. That was the part of the job her father never talked about. Not the shot, not the wind, not the calculation, or the trigger discipline, or the long cold hours in the dirt. The part he never talked about was what you carried afterward. What you filed away in the place where you kept things that were true and necessary, and not something you were ever going to explain to anyone who hadn't been there. She lay down on her bunk without taking off her boots. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She was woken at 215 hours by Kowalski knocking twice on her door frame, hard, the knock of someone who doesn't need to wait for permission. She was upright before the second knock landed. "Ward wants you," Kowalski said. He was fully kitted now. TOC, Maya reached for her boots. "What's the situation?" Kowalski's face was a thing she couldn't read in the dark, and he didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had something in it that she'd heard before, in people who were managing the gap between what they knew and what they were allowed to say. Reconnaissance asset just flagged a secondary Karimi network cell mobilizing in the valley. Intel thinks they may have located our Overwatch position from this morning. Maya laced her boots in the dark. And they may have a forward element already moving toward the ridgeline. Stood. How close? Kowalski looked at her in a way meant that the answer wasn't going to make the next few minutes easier. Close enough, he said, that Ward's asking whether you can make a night shot at 1,100 meters in a valley you've never seen from the other direction. Question hung in the dark between them. Maya picked up the MK-21 drag bag. TOC smelled like burnt electronics and unwashed gear. Maya pushed through the door behind Kowalski and found Ward standing over a fold-out table with a terrain map spread across it, 2 red light headlamps aimed at the paper, and haze on the radio in the corner. Reyes was already there, leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor, processing something he wasn't ready to say yet. There was a civilian in the room she didn't recognize. Middle-aged, thin, wearing a fleece vest over a button-down that had no business being in a forward operating base at 2 in the morning. He had the careful, slightly exhausted look of someone from the intelligence community, not the field variety, the kind that spent most of their time in rooms like this one, pulling data off terminals and translating it into things operators could use. Ward didn't look up when she entered. Sergeant Voss. Sit down or stand, I don't care. Just listen. She stood. The civilian Ward introduced him only as Mercer pulled up a satellite feed on a ruggedized laptop and rotated it so the table could see. The image was thermal, overhead, time-stamped 40 minutes ago. There was a ridgeline. There was a valley. There were 3 heat signatures moving along a route that Maya recognized after 4 seconds. The route to her Overwatch position from this morning. They backtracked the shot, Mercer said. His voice was the kind of quiet that came from knowing something nobody else in the room knew yet. We picked up cell intercepts about 90 minutes ago. Karimi's network had a remote observation post on the southern approach. We missed it in the pre-mission survey. They had a visual on the ridgeline this morning. Couldn't pinpoint the exact position. But they've had 11 hours to work the geometry. How close? Maya asked. Current pace. They're approximately 2 hours from the Overwatch site. Mercer adjusted the laptop angle. Problem is the Overwatch site isn't the objective. We think they've placed a second element. He tapped the keyboard twice, and the satellite image shifted same valley, different sector, a kilometer to the south. 2 heat signatures stationary. Here, this position has a direct line of sight to the Phobie's eastern vehicle approach. Ward straightened up from the map. We have a resupply convoy scheduled to leave the FBOB at 530. 3 vehicles, 14 personnel. The eastern approach is the only viable route given last night's IED activity on the secondary roads. You pull the convoy, you tip them that we know, Hayes said from the corner. You run the convoy, you put 14 people in front of a prepared sniper position, Reyes said from the wall. Nobody disagreed with either of them. Ward looked at Maya. She looked at the thermal image. 2 stationary signatures. The position was elevated above the road approach, set into a cluster of rock formations that the satellite imagery showed as a natural hide, the kind of terrain feature that a competent shooter would recognize immediately, and a planner would have. Flagged 2 rotations ago, if anyone had thought to look. You want me to take the position before the convoy moves, she said. I want to know if it's a viable option, Ward said. You tell me? She studied the image for another 30 seconds. Ranged from a counter position on the western slope to the enemy hide. She estimated it at roughly 1,100 to 1,150 meters, depending on where she could establish. Darkness. Unknown wind conditions at night in that particular valley geometry. No prior observation data. 1 Kestrel reading from this afternoon that was 11 hours stale. What's the wind been doing overnight? She asked Mercer. ASSO station at the FOB recorded southwest at 6 to 11, mostly steady after 2,200. Valley inversions can mess with that cold air pools in the low ground, changes the wind gradient. I'd need Reyes. Obviously, Ward said. And I'd need 45 minutes minimum on the counter position before I could tell you whether the shot is viable. If the inversion is running, the wind at target elevation could be completely different from what I'm seeing at my position. You have 90 minutes before I need to make a decision about the convoy. She looked at the map. The western slope approach was manageable, rocky, steep in sections, but she'd done worse at altitude in colder temperatures. The bigger problem was the darkness. Night shots at over 1,000 meters weren't impossible, but they required a thermal or night vision capable optic, and the Mk-21 standard glass was not it. What imaging do you have for the rifle? Ward nodded at Kowalski, who produced a pulsar Digex unit from a hard case and set it on the table. She picked it up, examined it. The Digex was a digital day and night scope that could mount to a Picatinny rail. She'd used one twice, in a training context, in weather conditions, considerably more cooperative than what she was about to walk into. She set it back down. The zero shift from swapping optics will cost me, she said. I'll need to confirm at distance before I trust the data. There's no range on the western slope. I know. Silence. She picked up the Digex again. 90 minutes, she said. Reyes and I go dark on the western slope. We find a position. We build what data we can build from wind observation and known reference points on the terrain. The shot looks viable. I take it when they present. If it doesn't look viable, you get a radio call 30 minutes before the convoy window, and you reroute. She met Ward's eyes. That's the best I can offer you. Ward looked at her for a moment. What does doesn't look viable mean to you? It means the shot has less than reasonable probability of first-round effect given the conditions at execution. I'm not going to pull the trigger on a 50% scenario at this range with a 0 I don't fully trust. A miss or a hit on the wrong target, she stopped. You know what a miss costs you. He knew. A miss announced the counter position and gave the enemy shooters a direction to return fire. At best, Maya and Reyes were burned and running in the dark. At worst, the enemy element had a support element she didn't know about, and the entire dynamic collapsed in a direction that was difficult to manage. All right, Ward said. Move in 10. The western slope was worse than the imagery suggested. The satellite's picture had a resolution problem. In the lower rocky band, what looked like negotiable terrain from overhead was actually a series of fractured ledges with drop-offs that didn't read clearly on the thermal. Reyes went first on 2 of the harder transitions, testing weight limits and reporting back and hand signals. Maya followed with the Mk-21 in the drag bag and the Digex in a separate pouch, picking her way across rock that crumbled in ways that put her stomach somewhere in her throat and then solidified again under the next step. She didn't fall. She came close twice. The third time her boot slid on a frost-slicked ledge, Reyes reached back and caught her forearm without looking, the same way you catch something you know is going to drop, before you consciously register the motion. She steadied and he let go, and they kept moving. Neither of them mentioned it. They found their position at 250 hours, a natural shelf on the upper western slopes with a depression large enough for prone work, partially concealed by a fractured rock wall that would break their silhouette against the sky. Reyes established the spotting scope in 30 seconds. Maya assembled the Mk-21 with the Digex mounted, breathing through a process that was mechanical and necessary and required her to not think about the fact that she'd never fired this exact rifle-optic combination at distance in operational conditions. The Digex changed the reticle geometry. It changed the eye relief, changed the way she had to position her head behind the stock. These were small things that added up to a solution that was slightly off in ways she would normally correct over a range session before she trusted it for anything that mattered. She trusted it now because she had to. Wind, she said. Reyes had the Kestrel out, southwest at 4, very light. Quieter than the FOB reading suggested. Inversion? Feels like it. Cold air in the valley floor, wind gradients compressed. The effective wind at target elevation is probably higher than what I'm reading. Here we're low. On the slope, the target position is elevated. He paused. Hard to model without data points. Give me reference objects. Reyes scanned the valley with the spotting scope. He called out observable wind indicators, a sparse shrub on a rock formation 600 meters out, the thermal column above a smoldering fire at the compound ruins from this morning's operation, a piece of debris moving along the valley floor at roughly 800 meters. Maya tracked each one, building an informal wind profile across the flight path by observation and inference and the accumulated instinct of someone who'd spent most of her adolescence reading Montana weather systems that could kill livestock if you got them wrong. It wasn't science. It was experience wearing the costume of science. She found the enemy position at 318 hours. It presented as two shapes in the thermal return of the Digex still, compressed, occupying a notch in the rock formation that was almost invisible from any angle but directly west. They were good. She had to give them that. Whoever had positioned them knew terrain and knew concealment, and if the intelligence intercept hadn't flagged the cell movement, there was a reasonable chance the convoy at 530 would have rolled directly into a prepared lane with no warning. Tracked the position for 6 minutes without moving. Range, she said. Laser return is 1160. Confirmed twice. 1160 meters. In reduced light with a 0 she hadn't confirmed, into a wind profile she'd assembled from field observation with no hard data. She thought about what she'd said to Ward. Less than reasonable probability of first-round effect. She ran the numbers in her head. The MK-21 with the 0.338 Lapua, her round of choice, the one she'd loaded the magazine with back at the FOB, had a flight time at 1160 meters of approximately 1.4 seconds. In that 1.4 seconds, a 14-kilometer crosswind moved the bullet roughly 60 centimeters to the right of its intended path, and she needed to have already accounted for that before she pulled the trigger. The Digex reticle had Moe markings she trusted mechanically, but not optically, because she hadn't shot the system enough to know exactly where its real-world 0 sat relative to its indicated 0. She estimated the probable error margin at plus or minus 4 to 6 inches at this range. 4 to 6 inches was the difference between a clean result and a miss that started a very bad night. I need a vegetation indicator at 600, she told Reyes. He spent 90 seconds finding one a shrub on a rock shelf at approximately 580 meters, close enough. She held on it and watched it for 2 minutes. It moved in small, consistent waves. Southwest as reported. Steady, not gusting. She shifted back to the target position. Still there. Still stationary. The two signatures hadn't moved in 20 minutes, which meant they were in a long wait. They weren't anticipating action until closer to the convoy window. She had time. Not much, but some. I'm going to take a reference shot, she said. Reyes looked at her over the spotting scope. In the dark, she could see his expression well enough to read it. At what, he said. Rock face below the target position. There's a white calcite seam at approximately 1,100 meters, slightly below their elevation. Put a round into it. I observe the strike. I correct the optic, and then I have a real-world 0 confirmation at distance. That's going to make noise. The strike on rock at this range is going to sound like a crack from down the valley. Small and directional. At 2 in the morning with a muzzle brake venting at ground level, it'll be hard to localize. She paused. Hard, not impossible. Reyes was quiet for a moment. And if they hear it and relocate, then we've burned the position and Ward reroutes the convoy and nobody gets shot today. Except possibly us. I'm going to try to avoid that. He looked at her for another moment, then went back to the spotting scope. Rock face below target. I have a calcite seam at about 1110 meters. Bottom edge of their rock notch. He paused. You sure about this? She wasn't sure about this. She was operating on accumulated experience and a set of variables that contained more uncertainty than she was comfortable with, doing something she'd never done in a context where the margin for error was effectively zero. I'm sure the convoy moves at 530, and I need a real zero before I can give Ward anything worth having, she said. Reyes exhaled slowly. Your call, I'm on the scope. She fired. The Mk-21 cracked, and the muzzle brake vented, and the sound rolled across the western slope in a direction that would be hard to pin, not back toward the FOB, not toward the target position, but laterally into the rock formations on the upper slope that scattered it. Reyes's voice, 40 seconds later, strike is left, estimate 4 inches at range. Pulling the zero right, the Digex is reading about a half MOA wide. She adjusted the Digex reticle. It was a tool she didn't love and didn't fully trust and was going to use anyway because it was what she had. Confirm adjustment. Adjusted. You're closer. Call it 2 inches left, maybe. Okay. She watched the target position. Still there. Still stationary. No indication of reaction to the reference shot. She waited 3 minutes before she was willing to believe they hadn't heard it. Then Reyes said, very quietly, they're moving. She watched through the Digex. The 2 signatures had shifted not away from position, toward the edge of the rock notch. Looking out, not looking in her direction, looking down the valley toward the eastern vehicle approach. They're orienting for the convoy, she said. They've got hours yet. Not anymore. Something changed their timeline. She tracked them. Or someone told them something. Reyes reached for the radio handset. Call Ward. Not yet. Her eye was steady behind the Digex. The 2 figures were at the forward edge of the notch now, positioned with a clear sight line down the approach vector. She could see a weapon system on the forward signature. The thermal signature of the barrel was distinct from the body heat, extending forward, long and narrow. The rifle, cloaked. Reyes. I see it. The lead signature has a long gun. He's setting up. At 2:30 in the morning. Yeah. Something had changed. Either the timeline had accelerated, or they'd picked up the reference shot after all, and were repositioning in a way that wasn't retreat. She didn't know which, and she had about 30 seconds to decide whether it mattered. She keyed the radio herself. Actual. This is Overwatch. I have 2 confirmed hostile signatures at the target position. Weapons visible. They're orienting toward the eastern approach. Something has changed their timeline. Ward's voice came back tight and fast. Overwatch. We just got word from the convoy element. They moved up departure to 430. Resupply priority change came down an hour ago. Nobody updated us until now. Maya felt something cold settle in her chest that wasn't the mountain air. What's their current position? They rolled out 7 minutes ago. They're on the eastern approach. 7 minutes. At convoy speed on that road, she ran the calculation without intending to 7 minutes, put them roughly 4 kilometers out from the kill zone. ETA to the approach vector? She asked. A pause while someone on Ward's end calculated. 14 minutes, maybe less. She looked at the target position. The lead signature was fully set up prone, weapon forward, completely still. The second signature was elevated slightly, probably spotting. Overwatch, can you take the shot? Ward asks. She had a zero she'd confirmed once on a reference target with a 2-inch error margin at 1100 meters. The approach was now 1160. She had a wind profile built from observation with no hard data confirmation at target elevation. She had a thermal optic she'd mounted 45 minutes ago and fired once. And she had 14 minutes. Working it, she said. She went back to the scope. Reyes, without being asked, started talking. Lead signature is stationary. He hasn't shifted in 90 seconds. Wind at the vegetation indicator is consistent. Southwest at 4, no change. If there's an inversion gradient, the wind at their elevation is probably running 6 to 8, same bearing. He paused. Your corrected 0 is showing 2 inches left. At 1160 versus 11, that's going to shift another inch right. At range, you probably want to call it 1 inch left and trust the ballistics. Agreed. She made the mental adjustment. She built the firing solution. She held it in her head the way her father had taught her to hold things not lightly, not tightly, but with the particular kind of grip that doesn't shake because it doesn't strain. Her breathing went to the 4 count. The lead signature was still. She needed him still for 1 more second. Wind, she said. Southwest 4, steady. Call it. She exhaled half a breath. She squeezed. The Chem 21 hit her shoulder. The Digex went white for a half second and then cleared, and she was back in the picture, and the lead signature at 1160 meters had collapsed sideways across the rock and was not moving. The second signature bolted. Upright, scrambling backward, not toward the approach vector, away from it, north along the ridge, moving fast in a way that said the person was scared rather than trained. Second target is moving north along the ridge, she said into the radio. She was already tracking. Running, not tactically withdrawing. Let him go, Ward said immediately. We need him to run. Don't take the shot. She took her finger off the trigger. Copy. She watched the second signature move north until it was out of the Digex's field. Her heart rate was doing something she noticed, without reacting to faster than she wanted, slower than it could have been. She held the scope on the collapsed lead signature for 30 seconds, confirming no movement. Then she pulled back from the rifle and sat up on the cold rock and exhaled. Ray said nothing for almost a full minute. Then, I'm calling Ward. Go ahead. He keyed the radio. Actual, this is Overwatch. Lead target is down and confirmed. Second target is moving north on the ridgeline. No longer a threat to the approach vector. Convoy should be clear. Ward's voice. Copy. Overwatch. Good work. Hold your position. Maya looked at her hands. She looked at that for a moment, at the steadiness, with the detached curiosity satumtran checking a piece of equipment to make sure it was still operational. Her father's hands had always been steady. She'd watched them across 1,000 mornings, at the bench, at the range, loading rounds at the kitchen table, with a care that looked like prayer but wasn't. Steady and certain and completely without performance. She'd asked him once how he kept his hands from shaking. He'd looked at her over the half-loaded magazine with an expression she still couldn't entirely decode, part amusement, part something older and heavier. They shook plenty when I was your age, he'd said. You don't stop them from shaking. You just do the work until the shaking doesn't matter. Picked up the Kestrel meter and read the wind. Southwest at 4, unchanged. The convoy arrived at the FOB at 438, 8 minutes ahead of its adjusted schedule. 14 personnel, 3 vehicles, no contact, no incident. Ward called it over the radio in the flat tone of confirmed good news that didn't need embellishment, and Maya listened to it from the western slope, where she and Reyes were beginning the process of recovering the position and preparing for exfil. She disassembled the Mk-21 in the dark, by feel. The Digex came off first, the scope second. She broke the rifle into its components with the same methodical care she'd used in every field condition she'd ever operated in, accounting for each piece before the next one came apart, because a missing component in this terrain meant a problem she didn't want. Reyes had the spotting scope packed and was running the route back to the eastern ledge from memory. He stopped at the fractured ledge where she'd slipped on the way up and waited without being asked, positioned to catch a load or an arm or whatever the descent required. Came down the ledge without incident. He moved on. They didn't talk during the exfil. There was nothing that needed to be said that couldn't wait for a room with a chair and something hot to drink. What she was thinking about on the dark slope above the Kondar Valley, with the drag bag heavy across her back and the first pale hint of pre-dawn gray, beginning somewhere behind the eastern mountains, was not the shot. She'd filed the shot in the place where she filed necessary things and moved forward from it. What she was thinking about was Mercer's voice when he'd said, "We missed it in the pre-mission survey." There had been a remote observation post on the southern approach. Missed. And then a prepared sniper position on the eastern vehicle route. Not missed by accident, placed after the morning operation. Responsive to information that had moved faster than the intelligence chain that was supposed to be ahead of it. Karimi's network had been reactive and fast and operating with better information sharing than the pre-mission package had suggested. That meant someone had looked at the pre-mission package and decided it was adequate. It also meant the pre-mission package was produced by people who were working with a particular picture of the network's capability. And that picture was wrong. She wasn't an intelligence officer. She wasn't paid to audit pre-mission packages. But she'd taken 2 shots in less than 18 hours at positions that shouldn't have existed, and she was walking down a dark slope on a mountain above a valley full of people who were adjusting their tactics in real time. She thought about that, the way her father had taught her to thinking about things she couldn't immediately solve by setting them somewhere she could find them again and moving on to what was directly in front of her. What was directly in front of her was a frost-slicked rock that she stepped over carefully. Then another. Then the flat ground at the base of the slope where a vehicle was waiting with its lights off, and Kowalski in the driver's seat looking at his watch. "You're late," he said. "Traffic," Reyes said, climbing in. Maya put the drag bag in the back and got in after it. The vehicle moved before she had the door fully closed, which was the appropriate response to the situation, and she braced against the door frame and watched the slope she'd just come down disappear into the dark behind them. Kowalski drove the way he did everything else efficiently, without drama, taking the route that was fastest rather than smoothest. The FOB lights appeared after 7 minutes, and the gate came open as they approached, and the vehicle pulled through into the compound and stopped. Ward was standing at the vehicle bay entrance. He looked at Maya when she climbed out. Not at Reyes, not at Kowalski, at her. The expression was still something she couldn't name. But it had moved again, settled into something that was very close to not gratitude, that wasn't quite right, something more like recognition. The kind that happens when you've been watching a thing from a skeptical distance and then been shown definitively and without performance that you were wrong about it. He didn't say anything immediately. He let the silence hold for a moment. Then, convoys in. 14 personnel accounted for. "Good," Maya said. "Intel is running the second target's route north. They think he'll try to link up with a secondary cell in the upper valley." Ward's voice was even. "If he gets there, they'll know we have a counter-precision capability operating in this sector." She understood what that meant. It meant the geometry changed. It meant whatever came next would be designed around the assumption that Shadow Tide had a shooter who could work at this range in these conditions, and the enemy would plan accordingly. "That's a problem for the intelligence team," she said. "It is," Ward agreed. He paused. "Get cleaned up. Full debrief at 700. She moved past him toward the interior. She heard him say, quietly, almost to himself, "Who the hell are you, Voss?" She didn't answer. She walked through the door and into the corridor, beyond and toward the room that had a cot with her name on it, and maybe 3 hours before she needed to be functional again. She set the drag bag down next to the cot and sat on the edge of the mattress and worked her boots off in the dark. Her shoulders ached. Her right eye had the specific post-scope fatigue that always took a day to resolve. She had a bruise developing on her right palm from where she'd steadied herself on the ledge, and her left knee had a cut from a rock she hadn't seen in the dark that she'd deal with in the morning. She lay down. She thought about her father. Not the rifle, not the shots, not the wind data. She thought about the way he'd looked on Sunday mornings on the back porch, coffee in both hands, watching the mountains the way some people watch the ocean, with the attention of someone who never gets tired of the size of the thing. The thing. She'd asked him once what he was looking for. Nothing, he'd said. I'm just looking. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Kandar Mountains were just beginning to show themselves against a lightening sky, and somewhere on a ridge to the north, a man was running toward people who were going to tell him something that would change how they came at this valley in the days ahead. She'd worry about that at 700. Her breathing slowed. Her hands stayed still. She was out in less than 4 minutes, and she didn't dream. And when the knock came at 640, it was Reyes, not Kowalski, which meant whatever was waiting in the debrief room had already started moving before it was supposed to. Ward wants everyone in the TOC, Reyes said through the door. Now not 700. Maya sat up in the dark. What happened? Pause on the other side of the door. That lasted half a second too long. Mercer got something off the Intercept network, Reyes said. Something about who Karimi was moving money to. Another pause. Apparently, the account is domestic. The word sat in the dark between them for a moment. Domestic. Maya reached for her boots. She was pulling her second boot on when it clicked. Domestic. Not a foreign account routed through shell structures in the usual way Mercer had said the account was domestic. American soils, American banking infrastructure, which meant Karimi hadn't just been moving money to fund network operations in country. He'd been moving money to someone who lived inside the wire of whatever system was supposed to be stopping him. Maya stood up and grabbed her jacket. The TOC was already full when she pushed through the door. Ward at the table, Hayes against the left wall with his arms folded and his jaw tight. Reyes had come in behind her. Kowalski was in the corner eating something from a foil pouch without looking at it, which was his way of managing situations that hadn't resolved into action yet. Mercer was at the laptop, and next to him was a face. Maya didn't recognize a woman. Early 40s, short hair, wearing a gray fleece with no insignia, and the particular expression of someone who had clearances Maya probably didn't and wasn't going to mention it. Ward didn't do introductions. Sit down, he said. And then, when everyone had, Mercer cleared his throat. He had the look of someone who'd been awake since the Intercept came in and was running on a kind of focused urgency that hadn't yet tipped into exhaustion. At 340, we pulled a high-confidence intercept from the Karimi Network's communication chain. The content references a financial transfer, 3 transactions totaling approximately 2.4 million, routed through a cutout account in the Cayman Islands and then into a domestic account registered to a logistics consultancy in Virginia. He paused. The consultancy is a shell. We've seen the cover structure before, but the end beneficiary account has a transaction history that links it to an active Department of Defense contractor operating in this region. The room was quiet. Hayes said, "Which contractor?" "Company called Verispan Tactical Solutions. They hold contracts for pre-mission survey support, site assessment, and intelligence packaging for several units operating in Kandar Province." Mercer looked at the table, including the pre-mission package for yesterday's operation. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Now, Maya thought about what she'd been turning over on the slope, the missed observation post, the prepared position on the vehicle approach, a network that had moved faster than the intelligence chain. She thought about those things and looked at the table and felt the pieces land in an arrangement that was both logical and deeply unpleasant. The survey team that missed the Southern OP, she said. Verispan? Mercer looked at her. Verispan's personnel conducted the site survey 48 hours before the operation. Yes. So they knew where we were going, Hayes said. Flat. Not a question. They had the Overwatch position coordinates, the assault approach vectors, and the HVT timing window. All of it. Mercer closed the laptop. We don't know yet if this was active betrayal or if their systems were penetrated and Karimi's people pulled the information laterally. Either way, the network had our mission package before we hit the ground. Ward had been listening with his hands flat on the table and his eyes somewhere between Mercer and the middle distance. Now he spoke, which means the OP on the southern approach wasn't a lucky placement, he said. No, it was targeted. They knew the Overwatch window and they tried to get eyes on the shooter's position before the operation so they could respond to the shot. They just didn't get there in time. Correct. And when the shot happened and they couldn't localize the position precisely, they worked the geometry overnight. Mercer glanced at Maya. Two-man element on the western slope tonight was a targeted counter-precision effort. They had a good enough fix on the ridgeline from this morning to know the valley. Western face was the secondary Overwatch option. The woman in the gray fleece had not spoken. Maya had been peripherally tracking her through. All of this she hadn't moved, hadn't changed expression, had the stillness of someone performing a very deliberate kind of patience. "Who are you?" Maya asked her directly. The woman looked at her with calm, dark eyes. "I work with Mercer," she said. "That's not what I asked." A beat of silence. Ward didn't intervene. "My name is Adrian Solis," the woman said. "I'm running the financial investigation on the Karimi Network's domestic connections. How long have you known about the Verispan link?" Solis studied her for a moment before answering. 48 hours. The number landed in the room like a physical thing. 48 hours meant Solis had known before the operation. Before Maya and 6 operators inserted into a valley with a compromised mission package. Before the convoy rolled out at 430 toward a prepared kill zone. Hayes had gone very still against the wall. Ward's hands hadn't moved from the table. "Explain that," Ward said. His voice was exactly the same tone it always was, which was somehow more alarming than if it had changed. "The link was preliminary at 48 hours, Solis said. She didn't move, didn't adjust her posture, didn't perform any of the usual physical vocabulary of defensiveness. We had a transaction flag on the Verispan account. We didn't have confirmation of what the transactions represented, or whether the connection to Karimi's network was causal or coincidental. Taking action on a preliminary flag against a DoD contractor, shutting down their access, alerting the units they support, that's not a decision I make unilaterally. And it's not a decision that gets made in 48 hours through normal channels. People almost died tonight, Hayes said. I know that. 2 shots at over 1,000 meters in the dark. That's how close it was. Solis looked at him and said nothing, which was a more honest response than most of the things people said in rooms like this one. Ward let the silence run for a few seconds, and then he moved on. Because that was what Ward did. He let people sit in the weight of a thing for exactly as long as was necessary, and then he picked up the work. What do we do with this? He asked Solis. We need to establish whether Verispan's exposure was penetration or active betrayal. That distinction determines what we do with the personnel involved and how we handle the contractor relationship going forward. She pulled a tablet from the bag beside her chair. We also have a secondary problem. Karimi is dead, but the financial transfers indicate the relationship with the domestic account was ongoing. This wasn't a one-time payment for a single operations intelligence. This was a structured arrangement. How long? Minimum 18 months based on the transaction history we've reconstructed. 18 months. Maya did the arithmetic without wanting to. 18 months of pre-mission packages. How many operations? How many Overwatch positions and assault vectors and timing windows that had been seen before the units carrying them hit the ground? There are other units operating in this sector, she said. Yes, Solis said. Have you flagged them? We're in the process. That's not an answer to the question I asked. Solis looked at her again with those calm, dark eyes. Some have been flagged. The process is ongoing. There are protocols for this that exist, for reasons that have nothing to do with bureaucratic preference. If we move too fast and Verispan's personnel detect that we're onto them, we lose the ability to trace where else the exposure goes. Maya understood that, but she understood it. Ward looked around the room. Here's where we are. We have a compromised intelligence source that's been feeding mission-critical data to a now-deceased HVT's network. We have an ongoing domestic financial investigation that is above this unit's operational purview. We have a secondary Karimi cell in the upper valley that now knows this FOB has a precision shooter. And we have a mission window that closes in. He checked his watch. Approximately 11 hours when the next phase of Karimi network disruption operations is scheduled to begin. He looked at Maya. She met his eyes and waited. The next phase involves a precision interdiction at a secondary network node. Different valley, different terrain profile, same range parameters. He paused. The site's survey for that operation was conducted by Verispan 4 days ago. The room processed that, which means the site survey is compromised, Reyes said. Possibly. Probably. Ward kept his eyes on Maya. We need an independent survey. Ground truth the Overwatch options, validate the approach vectors, assess any prepared positions in the target area. He paused again. I want Voss on the survey team. Hayes straightened against the wall. She's a shooter, not a... She read terrain correctly twice in 24 hours, in conditions that would have been difficult for anyone, Ward said. He wasn't looking at Hayes. She identified the western slope counterposition before Mercer's intercept, confirmed it existed. She built a firing solution from field observation with no data support and made it work at 11's 60 meters in the dark. A pause. I want her on the survey team. Questions. Again, not really a question. Hayes said nothing. Maya said, when do we move? 800. Four-person element. You, Reyes, Kowalski, and Hayes. He looked at Hayes when he said the last name, and Hayes received it with the expression of a man who had objections and had just been told clearly that they didn't belong in this room. 6 hours to survey and be back before the operation window, Maya said. 5.5. That's tight. It is, Ward agreed. Don't miss anything. The valley was called Sherdal on the maps and something else in the local dialect that didn't translate easily. It was narrower than the Kondar Valley, the wall was steeper, the floor choked with a seasonal riverbed that was mostly dry now and would be impassable in spring. The approach was from the south, on foot, through a boulder field that had been deposited by some prehistoric event and never cleaned up. They moved in a diamond formation, Kowalski on point, Hayes rear, Reyes, and Maya in the middle, with the terrain survey equipment split between them. Nobody talked. The sun was up, and the light was flat and white and cold, the kind of cold that didn't argue with you, but also didn't let you forget it was there. Maya had the Mk-21 in the drag bag and a suppressed M4 on her chest. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours, and her left knee had a cut that was going to need cleaning properly when she got back to the FOB. She felt functional. Not excellent, not fresh functional. She'd learned a long time ago that functional was enough. Functional was what you worked with. They reached the first candidate Overwatch position at 934, a shelf on the eastern wall of the valley, high enough for a good angle on the target compound, a kilometer to the north. Kowalski checked it first, confirming the rock was stable, the approach concealed, the escape route viable. Then Maya moved into the depression and looked at the compound through her binoculars. She spent 8 minutes on the position, building a mental picture. Natural obstacles, line-of-sight clearances at different elevations within the compound. Wind indicators there were 3 she could use at different distances. She noted a problem with the eastern wall, a rock formation at 600 meters that created a wind shadow, which meant the actual wind on the far side of it at the target distance was probably different from what she'd be feeling on her side. Maybe significantly different depending on the wind angle. She noted it. She moved to the second candidate position. The second position was where the Verist Span survey had recommended the primary Overwatch site. She found the problem in 6 minutes. It was a prepared shell scrape, subtle, worked into the existing rock depression, in a way that looked natural, unless you were looking for human tool marks. Somebody had spent time on this position. Not a lot of time, not with heavy equipment, but time. The rock at the depression's forward edge, had the loosed to improve the sight angle, and the loose debris from the chipping had been scattered backward and partially covered with dust to conceal the fresh break. She didn't touch it. She stood back from it and looked at it and called Hayes over. He came up beside her and looked where she was looking. Pause. That's a prepared hide, he said. Yes. Not ours. No. He looked at her. She could see him working through the implication. If we'd set up in this position for the operation, you'd be in a known location, she said. They'd have your grid, your approach, your position, your line of fire. She stepped back from the hide. The survey recommendation wasn't a mistake. It was a placement. They wanted us here. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Particular quiet of a man revising something significant. How'd you spot it? Fresh rock break on the forward edge. The debris scatter pattern is deliberate, too, even. And the depression orientation is slightly off for the natural erosion angle of the rock face. Something worked it. He looked at the hide again, then at her. I've done 4 rotations in this country, he said. I walked past this position. She wasn't going to make a thing of it. She turned away. We need to document it and find the real Overwatch option. We're burning time. They documented it. Reyes photographed every angle with a tactical camera, and then Maya moved north along the valley wall, above the prepared hide, looking for what should have been there. She found it 40 meters higher on the rock face. A natural position that the Verispan survey hadn't mentioned. It was harder to access, required a traverse across a section of exposed rock that would take 10 minutes and some care, and it was less comfortable to work from, and it had a slight angle problem with the northwest corner of the target compound that would require a creative solution. But it wasn't known to anyone who had seen the Verispan package, and it was real. She called Reyes up, and they spent 20 minutes on it, building range data and wind profiles, and confirming the sight angles. The northwest corner problem was manageable. There was a natural depression in the compound layout that would bring the HVT through the correct angle of exposure at some point during the operational window based on the pattern of life data from the mission package, assuming the pattern of life data wasn't also compromised. She noted that concern and kept it to herself for the moment. By 1,100, they were moving back toward the exfil point, and by 1,215, they were back at the FOB. Ward was waiting in the TOC with Mercer and Solis, and a new face, a signals officer Maya hadn't met, who looked like he'd also been awake since something unpleasant happened, and was managing it the way people manage things when there's no alternative. Maya thus laid out the survey findings on the table. The prepared hide at the Verispan recommended position. The alternative position 40 meters above. The range data, the wind profile, the sight angle solutions. She explained the northwest corner problem and the pattern of life dependency, and why she thought it was manageable with real-time adjustment. Ward listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What's your confidence level in the alternative position?" High for the basic firing solution. Conditional on the pattern of life holding for the sight angle. The HVT doesn't move through the correct sector. The shot becomes difficult to impossible from that position. She paused. The Verispan package said the HVT has a consistent movement pattern. He goes to the courtyard north side between 1,400 and 1,600 daily. That data is genuine. How do we know it's genuine? We don't. We assume it because it's what we have, and we run the operation against it while being prepared for it to be wrong. She met his eyes. Or we scrub the operation. Ward said nothing. Hayes, from the side of the room, said, "We scrub it, the network node doesn't go down. And whatever Karimi's people are rebuilding in the upper valley has more time to get set. I know, Maya said. So we run it, Hayes said. Not to Ward. To her. She looked at him. The man who had questioned her qualifications at every step, who had walked past the prepared hide, who was now looking at her across the TOC table as though she were someone whose judgment he was prepared to weight against his own. We run it, she said, but we don't put anyone in the prepared hide. The operation proceeds from the alternative position, and we assume the network has some knowledge of our intentions, which means we move earlier than the package indicates. We don't use the standard approach vectors, and we have an extraction plan that doesn't rely on anything from the Verispan package. Ward said agreed. He looked at Solis. Anything on Verispan that changes the operation calculus? Solis shook her head. Not yet. We're still running the financial trace. We haven't moved on the personnel. How long? 48 to 72 hours for the domestic side to build a case that holds. The operation is in 3 hours, Ward said. I know. Take down the network node today, and Verispan's people know the operation went through. They'll know we burned the prepared hide. Yes, Solis said. That's a problem for the investigation. But not taking down the node is also a problem, and it's a problem that manifests faster. She paused. Run your operation, Captain. We'll manage the investigation consequences. Ward nodded once. That was the decision made. He looked at Maya. You've been awake for how long? Long enough. That's not. Long enough to take the shot, she said. That's what matters. A pause. Get some food and be ready to move at 1,430, he said. The insertion into Sherdal Valley was different from Kandar. They moved in on foot from a vehicle drop 3 kilometers south, through the boulder field in the early afternoon light, with none of the cover of darkness and all of the exposure of a terrain that had been walked twice already today. Maya moved fast, and she moved low, and she watched every rock formation above the valley walls for the particular silhouette of a person who was watching back. She didn't see anyone. That didn't mean no one was there. The traverse to the alternative overwatch position took 14 minutes harder than the survey pass, because now she was carrying the MK-21 and the full optics package and the Kestrel and a load that was trying to pull her backward on the exposed rock section. Reyes went first, and she handed up the drag bag before she made the last section herself, pulling on a rock edge that held, and then a second one that shifted under her hand and made her stomach drop before she got her weight onto the ledge and stayed. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be. She assembled the MK-21, mounted the day's scope, and settled into the depression. The compound was 1.40 kilometers to the north. She could see the main gate, the interior courtyard, the north side terrace, where the HVT was supposed to appear between 1,400 and 1,600. It was currently 1,448. Reyes, she said. I'm on. He had the spotting scope up. Range to the north terrace is confirmed at 1040. Wind is southwest at 8, gusting to 12. Gust cycle is irregular, no clean pattern. Irregular gust cycles were the part of the job she disliked most. A regular gust gave you a rhythm. You felt for the lull, you called the shot, you had a predictable window. An irregular cycle meant you were reading micro-indicators on the fly dust movement, heat shimmer, the behavior of the spotter's wind flags, and making a judgment call that had no clean formula behind it. Her father had called it listening to the valley. She listened. Ward's voice came on the radio at 1,503. Overwatch, assault element is in position at the south gate. We're holding for your signal. What's the status? Target hasn't presented. Watching the north terrace. Copy. How long do you need when he shows? 30 seconds to confirm the sight angle and read the wind. She paused. Maybe less. We have a 40-minute operation window before the light gets difficult. Understood. At 1,511, the north terrace door opened. A man stepped out, medium height, wearing a dark field jacket, moving with the slightly deliberate pace of someone doing a habitual thing on a habitual schedule. He stopped at the terrace railing and looked north up the valley, the direction that was away from her, and stood there with his hands in his pockets. "Reyes," she said. "I'm on him. Stand by for biometric." A pause of 15 seconds that felt considerably longer. Positive ID. That's the target. She had him in the scope. The sight angle from the alternative position was tight. The northwest corner of the compound wall created a partial obstruction that she'd noted in the survey, and the target was standing in the only sector of the terrace that was fully exposed from her angle. It was approximately 2 meters from the railing, north. The wind hit a peak. She waited. It dropped. She waited for what she estimated was the bottom of the irregular cycle no formula, just listening, and she felt the air on her cheek go momentarily still, and she called it. "Firing," she said. She squeezed. The MK-21 fired, and the target dropped, and the north terrace door flew open 2 seconds later, and 2 men came out and froze at what they found, and Ward's voice was already on the radio. "Overwatch confirm. Target is down," Reyes said. "Confirmed hit. No movement. Assault element is moving. Hold position." Below, the compound erupted in the precise, controlled chaos of a prepared assault element hitting a gate that was now occupied by confused and reacting personnel rather than the organized defense it would have been if the network had had better information about where exactly the shot came from. The Verispan package had put her in a prepared hide at a known location. Instead, she was meters above it, at a position nobody had surveyed, firing from an angle that the compound's defensive posture hadn't been oriented to cover. 38 seconds after the first shot, Ward's team was through the gate, kept the scope on the compound's roof access points and exterior walls, calling movement to Reyes, who relayed to Ward, building a real-time picture of the compound's interior response, where people were moving, where weapons were appearing, where the assault element was about to encounter resistance before they encountered it. 2 armed personnel moving from the eastern interior toward the courtyard, bearing brick 090 from the main gate. "They're going to come up on your left flank," she said. "Ward, copy. Hayes, you've got 2 coming from your 9 o'clock. A burst of contact, brief, and then silence. "Courtyard clear," Hayes said on the radio. Moving interior, she tracked the roof. A single figure appeared at the northeast corner, not with a weapon, moving in the low-crouched scramble of someone trying to get away rather than someone trying to fight. She tracked him without her finger on the trigger. Roof, northeast corner, unarmed, moving east. Looks like he's heading for a rope or ladder descendant on the far side. "Ward, let him run. We want him talking." Copy. She watched him run. Compound went quiet in the particular way. That meant the assault element had control, not the silence of nothing happening, but the structured silence of a coordinated team moving through rooms with deliberate purpose. You could hear fragments of Ward's internal net in her earpiece, short, compressed transmissions, the call and response of CQB that moved faster than sentences. "Room clear, moving, contact, down, moving, clear, sensitive site, hold." Kept the scope on the perimeter. At 1538, Ward's voice came on the main net. "Overwatch, objective is secure. Sensitive site exploitation is underway. All personnel accounted for." She stayed on the scope for another 4 minutes. Habit or something close to it. Then she pulled back and sat up on the rock and looked at the valley around her. The steep walls, the dry riverbed, the afternoon light going amber, and long across the boulder field to the south. Beautiful in the indifferent way. Same as always. Reyes was already packing the spotting scope. She disassembled the MK-21 and packed the MK-21 and sat for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Her hands were steady. She looked at that the way she always did, with the quiet, detached inventory of someone checking their own equipment. Still there, still working. Good call on the position, Reyes said. He wasn't looking at her. He set it to the spotting scope case. It was just higher, she said. It was the right higher. She didn't answer that. She reached for the drag bag and shouldered it, and looked north one more time at the compound a kilometer away. Inside it, Ward's team was pulling documents and devices, and everything that could be carried and would tell someone in a room far from here something about how the network had functioned and where its money came from, and this who, on the domestic side, had helped keep it alive. She thought about Solis in the TOC, with her gray fleece and her 48 hours of knowledge, and her careful explanation of why the protocols existed. She thought about a logistics consultancy in Virginia with $2.4 million in its account. She thought about the prepared hide chipped into the rock of the alternative position's lower shelf, and whoever had spent the time doing the chipping. She thought about what 48 more hours meant for people who might be running operations out of the next compromised package while the domestic investigation moved through its proper channels. She turned away from the compound and started moving down the rock face toward the ex-focal point. Behind her, Reyes followed, and the valley was quiet, and the afternoon light kept going amber and long across everything, indifferent to all of it. They were back at the FOB by 1,640. Ward was in the TOC with Solis and Mercer and the signals officer, and something had changed in the room from the last time Maya had walked into it. Particular quality of the air, the tension that had been running through the past 24 hours in a taut, continuous thread had shifted into something different. Not relaxed. Tighter maybe, but differently tight. The tightness of a situation that was about to move from one phase into another. She read it before Ward said a word. He looked at her when she came in and said, "We have a problem." She set the drag bag down. Solis's team just flagged a third domestic account linked to Karimi's network, he said. Structure, different shell company, different routing. This one's been active for 26 months. He paused. The account has transaction history that links it to a federal employee with access to unit deployment schedules across 3 forward operating bases in this region. Deployment schedules, not just mission packages. The larger picture, which units were where, when they were moving, what their operational cycles looked like. Who? She said. Ward looked at her steadily. That's the problem, he said. The account flags to a name we recognize. The room was very quiet. Maya looked at Ward and then at Solis, and she understood from both of their expressions that whatever name was attached to the account, it was not a name that was going to make the next phase of this simple. Who? She asked again. Ward said the name. And the room stayed quiet, and outside the afternoon was going dark over the Condor Mountains. And somewhere in Virginia, a federal employee with access to deployment schedules was not yet aware that a financial trace had just arrived at their door. The name was Colonel Dennis Hargrove. Maya heard it and did not move. She stood in the middle of the TOC, with the drag bag strap still in her hand and the name sitting in the air between her and Ward, like something that had weight and temperature and was not going to dissipate, just because nobody wanted to be in the same room with it. Hargrove, who had summoned her to his office on a Tuesday afternoon and handed her a manila folder and said Shadow Tide specifically requested a precision specialist in a voice that had been stripped of most of its. Register by 30 years of cold weather and stress. Hargrove, who had told her that Ward had been directed, not recommended, directed to accept her on the team. Hargrove, who had appeared on the secure video link at the first debrief and said, "Good work," Sergeant Voss, in a tone that she'd read as professional approval. She thought about what it meant that Hargrove had directed her specifically onto this operation. She thought about a compromised mission package and a prepared hide and a convoy that had moved its net by 90 minutes and nearly rolled into a kill zone. She thought about the second target she'd been told to let run north and whether that runner had been told to run and where exactly he'd run to. She thought about all of that in the space of about 4 seconds. Then she set the drag bag down. "How solid is the account link?" she asked. Solis had her tablet open. 2.1 million across 26 months. The shell company is registered to a Nevada LLC with a single listed officer who doesn't exist. The routing chain has 4 layers, but the terminal account is a personal investment account in Hargrove's name at a brokerage in McLean, Virginia. She looked up from the tablet. "Solid. Does he know you've flagged it?" "Not yet. We have a 12 to 18-hour window before the domestic team moves on the financial institutions and the notifications become unavoidable." Ward had been watching Maya since he'd said the name. Watching her the way he watched things that were giving him information. He needed to process carefully. "You had contact with Hargrove before this operation," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, delivered with the same flat precision he applied to everything. "He assigned you to your unit," she said. "He specifically directed your assignment." "Yes." "Which means he knew you'd be the shooter on the Karimi operation." She'd gotten there herself 40 seconds ago, but she let Ward say it because there was value in it being said aloud in a room with witnesses. "Yes," she said. The signals officer, in the corner his name she'd learned, was Lieutenant Faro, looked up from his terminal. If Hargrove knew the shooter's identity and background before the operation, he could have passed that to Karimi's network. They'd know they were dealing with someone from Red Valley. A tactical instructor. Not a combat-experienced shooter. He paused. That could be why the counter-precision response was what it was. They'd been told she was a soft target. Easy to displace. Reyes, still in the doorway, said, "They didn't account for the night shot." "No," Faro agreed. "They probably didn't." Mercer was at his laptop again, pulling something. "There's another element. The account flagged a transaction 4 days before the Karimi operation date. Corresponds to the Verispan site survey window. $11,000. Small relative to the larger transfers, but the timing. Payment for the survey compromise," Ward said. "Consistent with it." The room was quiet again, the specific quiet of people who had just assembled a picture they didn't want to be looking at and were now stuck looking at it. Maya sat down. Not because she was tired, though she was. Because she needed a moment to be still in the middle of something that was moving too fast in too many directions. Hargrove had put her on this operation, knowing the mission package was compromised. Had directed her specifically a shooter with no combat record, whose file showed nothing beyond an exceptional qualification score, into a position where the enemy network had been pre-briefed on her limited profile. The prepared hide had been placed at the survey-recommended position, which meant the expectation was that she'd set up exactly where Verispan's package told her to. A known location, a prepared response. The second shot on the Kondar ridgeline. The night shot on the western slope. The alternative position in Sherdal Valley. Every time she'd deviated from the expected position, she'd been operating outside the information that Hargrove had sold. Every time she hadn't been where they expected her to be, she'd survived. She thought about that for a moment. Then she thought about what Hargrove had said when she'd asked whether Ward had been told about her background. He's been told you're qualified. What he chooses to do with that information is between him and his conscience. She thought about thin files, about a qualification score in the 99th percentile with no special assignment notation. About the kind of file that looks ordinary until you know what's behind the ordinariness. "I need to tell you something," she said. Ward looked at her. "My file is thin because it was made thin," she said. On purpose. The room shifted slightly. Not physically, nobody moved, but the quality of attention in it changed. She hadn't planned to say this here. She hadn't planned to say it at all, because the arrangement had been built on the premise that thin files stayed thin, and explanations stayed unspoken, and the people who needed to know already knew, and everyone else operated on what they were given. But Hargrove had used the thin file as a weapon. He'd sold her profile to people who used it to build an ambush, and the ambush had nearly worked, and the reason it hadn't worked was sitting in this room and deserved to understand what it had been operating next to for the past 3 days. My father wasn't just a rancher who was good with a rifle, she said. He was Robert Voss. She watched the name land, watched the sequence of recognition move through the room at different speeds. Ray S. First, because Ray S. had been in long gun circles long enough to know the name, his expression going from neutral to something more careful. Faro a second later, cross-referencing something in his memory. Mercer last, reaching for the laptop and then stopping himself. Ward said nothing. His expression didn't change, but he went very still in the particular way that meant something significant had just reorganized itself behind his eyes. Robert Voss, Solis said. Not a question exactly. The tone of someone confirming a filing reference. He spent 14 years as a precision specialist with a classified unit that doesn't have a public designation, Maya said. He came home when I was 3. He bought land in Montana and became a rancher. He never talked about what he'd done, and nobody official ever talked about it either. And that was an arrangement everyone was comfortable with. She paused. He started training me when I was 8, not because he wanted me in the military. Because he said the skills were the skills regardless of what you did with them, and it was better to have them and not need them. He's deceased, Solis said, still in the reference-checking tone. 4 years ago, cardiac event. She said it the way she always said it, clean, factual, moving through it rather than around it, because around it was longer, and she'd learned that longer didn't actually help. Before he died, he made a phone call to someone he'd served with who was still active in the system. An arrangement was made. My enlistment record and my qualification scores went into a file structure that was deliberately unremarkable. The access notation that would normally flag my training background was removed. Why, Ward asked. Because he didn't want the skills to become a reason for anyone to put me in exactly the situation I'm currently in, she said. He understood what exceptional scores in a thin file would look like to certain kinds of commanders. And he was trying to make sure that nobody could pick me up and point me at something because I was useful and expendable. A beat of silence. That didn't work, Hayes said from the wall. It wasn't cruel. It was just accurate. No, Maya agreed. Didn't. She looked at Ward. Hargrove has access to personnel files across multiple units. He found the anomaly, the access notation removal, and worked backward from it. He knew what the thin file was hiding. Before he put me on this operation, she let that settle. He didn't send me because I was the only name that cleared both filters. He sent me because he thought I'd be the easiest name to lose. The room held that for a moment. Ward stood up from the table. He walked to the far side of the TOC, stopped at the wall, looked at the terrain map pinned there without seeing it. Then he turned around. He sent you in with a compromise package, Ward said, knowing you'd be setting up in a position the enemy already had. Knowing that when the first shot went, the counter-response would be oriented around a shooter profile that suggested limited capability. His voice was still even. And if you'd gone where the package told you to go, I'd have been in the prepared hide, she said, in a known location, with a response team that had been told I was an instructor, not a combat shooter. You'd be dead. She didn't answer that because it didn't need an answer. Hayes had moved away from the wall. He was standing in the middle of the room now, with his arms at his sides, and the expression of a man working through something that was making him want to put fist through a wall, managing it by holding very still. He's been running this for 26 months, Hayes said. How many operations? Nobody answered that either, because the number was a calculation nobody wanted to make in this room at this moment. And also because nobody had enough information to make it accurately, and an inaccurate number was worse than no number. Ward came back to the table. He looked at Solis, 12 to 18-hour window before the domestic team moves, he said. What happens when they move? Hargrove gets notification that his financial accounts have been flagged under a counterintelligence investigation. At that point, standard protocol requires him to be placed on administrative hold pending investigation. His access to classified systems is suspended. Solis's voice was careful and precise and slightly too controlled, the voice of someone managing their own reaction to a situation they'd seen versions of before and still found difficult. He can't destroy records once the flag is in place. The financial evidence is preserved regardless of what he does next. But until the domestic team moves, he still has full system access, Ward said. Yes, which means he knows we ran 2 operations today in Kandahar province. He knows the Karimi HVT is down and the Shirdal node is down. And depending on what his network inside Verispan looks like, he may already know the survey recommend Overwatch position in Shirdal wasn't used. That's possible. So he knows the operation went sideways. He doesn't know yet what we know about him, but he's going to be asking questions. Ward looked at Maya. He's going to want a debrief from you. The thought had occurred to her already. She'd been holding it to the side while she got through the rest of what needed to be said. When? She asked. He's scheduled a video call with this unit at 800 tomorrow for a post-operation review. Faro said from the corner. He'd been quiet for a while, managing something on his terminal. It was on the calendar before today's operations. Standard practice after a major interdiction. So, and Maya checked her watch. It's approximately 14 hours. I have a video call with the man who tried to get me killed. Yes, Ward said. Another silence. What do you want me to do? She asked. Ward spat back down. He looked at Solis. Can the domestic team accelerate their timeline? Move on the accounts before 800? I can make a call, Solis said, but accelerating means compressing the documentation phase. Messier legally. Defense attorneys will have more to work with. I'm not asking for perfect. I'm asking for 8 hours faster. I'll make the call. She stepped out of the TOC with her phone. The room breathed differently with one fewer person in it. Ward looked at Maya. If she can't get the timeline moved, we run the 800 call normally. You attend. You answer his questions about the operations without giving him anything he can use to understand what we know. You're a tactical instructor who went on her first combat deployment and did her job and is now reporting back to her commanding officer. He paused. Can you do that? I've been managing what people know about me for most of my adult life, she said. Yes. Hayes made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh and stopped itself. Ward's expression didn't change, but something around the edges of it shifted in a direction that was close to approval. There's another problem, Ray said from the doorway. He'd been so quiet for so long that the room had half forgotten he was there. The runner from last night, the second target on the western slope you told me, we let him run because Ward wanted him talking to the secondary cell in the upper valley. Correct, Ward said. If Hargrove has a communication channel into that network, the runner may have reported to someone who reported to Hargrove. Ward finished, closed his eyes for a half second, and Hargrove may already have a more complete picture of tonight than we want him to have. The silence this time was the worst kind, the silence of a problem that had just gotten larger than the room it was in. Faro said, from the corner, very quietly, there's traffic on the Hargrove communications flag. Solis's team put a passive monitor on his official accounts 48 hours ago, same time they flagged the financial link. He was reading something on his terminal. He made a call on his personal device at 1,712 today. Duration 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The number is unregistered burner, probably. Call was 47 minutes after our second operation concluded. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. 47 minutes after the Shirdal operation wrapped. He knows something went wrong, Maya said. He knows 2 operations ran today that his packages were supposed to support, and both targets are down, and neither position was where his surveyed packages put the shooter. Faro looked up from the terminal. He doesn't know what we know, but he knows something isn't right. Ward said he's going to use the 800 call to find out what. Yes, Maya said, which means the 800 call isn't just a post-operation review. It's an interrogation dressed as a debrief. It usually is, she said. Most debriefs are. Ward looked at her for a moment, with the expression she'd spent 3 days trying to name and had finally, somewhere in the last hour, found the right word for. It wasn't approval. It wasn't respect, exactly. It was recognition, the specific, unperformed recognition of one professional seeing another and understanding exactly what they're looking at. Get some rest, he said. We have a long morning. She didn't sleep. She lay on the cot in the dark and stared at the ceiling and worked through the problem the way her father had taught her, to work through problems, not by solving them. Because some problems couldn't be solved from the inside without more information, but by mapping them. Where the edges were, where the variables lived. What changed if one assumption was wrong? The thing she kept coming back to was the thin file. Her father had made a phone call. An arrangement had been made. The access notation had been removed. And she'd spent 6 years at Red Valley as a tactical firearms instructor with an exceptional qualification score and a deliberately unremarkable file. And she'd thought, in the way that you think things you don't examine too carefully, that the arrangement was holding. She hadn't examined it too carefully because examining it required thinking about why the arrangements had been necessary, thinking about her father's 14 years in a unit that didn't have a public designation. And thinking about that led to thinking about the particular way he'd looked on Sunday mornings on the back porch, not peaceful. Exactly, but resolved. The look of a man who'd made his decisions and lived in them. She'd understood what he was trying to protect her from, in the abstract. She hadn't understood it the way you understand things when they're actively happening to you. She understood it now. The cut on her left knee had been cleaned. Dressed aide Kowalski, who had produced a first aid kit from somewhere, and sat across from her in the corridor, and done a clean, economical job without comment, which was probably the most intimate interaction she'd had with another person in a week, and had lasted about 4 minutes. The knee hurt in a low, consistent way that she'd stopped noticing. 330, she gave up on sleep and went to the TOC. Ward was there. He hadn't left. He was at the table with 2 empty coffee cups and a terrain map, and the look of a man who had been awake long enough that sleep had stopped being a useful concept. He'd crossed into the territory beyond it, where you just operated. He looked up when she came in. Solis has got the timeline moved, he said. Domestic team is moving on the Hargrove accounts at 600. The administrative hold notification goes to his command at 615 before the 800 call. He'll know we know before he gets on the call, Ward said, which means either he doesn't show or he shows and comes at it differently than we expected, or he runs. There are people watching the exits. A pause. Figuratively, his access to classified travel systems will be locked at 615. He can't disappear without it being noticed immediately. Maya sat down across from him. She reached for one of the empty coffee cups and then reconsidered and set it back down. What happens to this unit? She asked. Ward looked at her. If Hargrove has been running this for 26 months, the compromise touches everything his office has handled. Operations, personnel assignments, intelligence packages. She kept her voice level. Question of how Shadow Tide gets sanitized and reconstituted, and whether anyone on this team had unknowing exposure to compromised information. That's going to be a long process. Yes, Ward said. It is. And while that process runs, the unit is probably stood down. Probably. She sat with that. The operational reality of it, a unit dismantled not by enemy action, but by the failure of the system it operated inside. People in it who were not responsible for Hargrove's choices, absorbing the consequences of those choices through a process that would be thorough and slow and would not feel just even when it was technically correct. "Hayes," she said. Ward's expression shifted slightly. "What about him? He's going to have questions about what he didn't see." He walked past the prepared hide in Sherdal. He's going to want to know whether that was a failure of observation or whether the Verispan package was specifically designed to misdirect someone with his experience level. She paused. "Those are different problems. One is his. One is Hargrove's." Ward looked at her steadily. "You've been paying attention to my team. You were paying attention to me. I was paying attention back. A beat of something that was as close to a shared moment of dark humor as two people in their situation were going to manage. Hayes is a good operator who was given bad information and didn't know it," Ward said. "That distinction will be made clear in the investigation. Make sure it's made clear to him before the investigation, not during." Ward nodded once, not agreeing to make a note of the recommendation, agreeing that it was the right call. They sat in silence for a while. The TOC had a low electrical hum that was always there and became perceptible only in quiet moments, a generator somewhere, or the ventilation system, or the accumulated electronic background noise of a facility that was always processing something. At 447, Solis came back into the TOC. She'd slept somewhere. She looked like a person who'd had 3 hours rather than no hours, which was better than most people in the building could claim. "Domestic team is in position," she said. 600 proceeds as planned. She sat down and opened the tablet. "There's something else. The financial trace on the Hargrove accounts flagged a transaction from 6 weeks ago that we missed in the initial review." She set the tablet on the table so both of them could see it. $50,000 outbound. To a shell account we hadn't seen before. We traced the shell this morning. Terminal Account is a private security consultancy in the DC area that has one actual client, a law firm that specializes in national security defense cases. Maya looked at the tablet. "He was paying for legal representation," she said, "before we flagged him. 6 weeks ago, Solis confirmed. Which means either he made a mistake and started preparing a legal defense before he had any reason to think he needed one, or someone told him 6 weeks ago that the financial investigation was getting close. So the second option was the one that mattered. Someone inside the investigation warned him," Ward said. "That's what it looks like. Which means the Karimi operation wasn't a response to something recent. He wasn't panicking. He was executing a plan that had a timeline attached to it." Ward looked at Maya. "You were supposed to be in that prepared hide. The operation was supposed to go wrong in a specific way. And 6 weeks ago, someone told Hargrove that the financial trace was coming, and he started moving the pieces." She thought about Hargrove in his office. "The Manila folder. You were the only name that cleared both filters. The careful, deliberate presentation of a decision that had already been made, not a selection process, a placement. He didn't just put me on the operation because I was expendable," she said. "Put me on the operation because I was invisible. Because whoever looked at the thin file and saw a tactical instructor from Red Valley would write off the failure as a predictable outcome." She paused. A shooter with no combat record, on her first operation, in a position the enemy already had. The after-action report writes itself, and the Karimi interdiction still gets credited, Ward said. The network node still gets disrupted. The mission succeeds. Cost is one shooter and a prepared hide. And Hargrove's name is on the operation as the authorizing officer, not as the liability. Clarity of it was almost architectural. She could see the whole structure now, each element supporting the others, each plausible deniability layered over the next. She'd been inserted into a plan that was designed to use her capability while eliminating the only person who could explain the deviation from the expected position. If she'd set up in the prepared hide and been killed by the counter-precision response, nobody would have known to look at Hargrove's accounts. The operation would have closed cleanly. The financial trace would have continued at its current pace, warned by its internal leak, and possibly been quietly redirected before it reached the terminal accounts. She'd survived by being where nobody expected her to be. And now she was sitting in a TOC at 500 in Kandahar province, and the man who'd tried to make her disappear was going to get a notification in 90 minutes that was going to tell him. The plan had failed. "I want to be on the 800 call," she said. Ward looked at her. "He needs to see me," she said. "He needs to know I'm here and I'm intact and I know what I know. Not because of what it does for the investigation. Because of what it does for him." What does it do for him? "It tells him the thing he spent 6 weeks planning didn't work," she said. "And it tells him that the person who broke it is the person he thought would be the easiest part." Ward held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said. 613, Solis received confirmation that the administrative hold notification had been delivered to Hargrove's command. 118, his classified system access terminated. At 641, a notification went to the Office of the Inspector General of the Department of Defense, flagging the financial investigation for counterintelligence review. At 800, the video call connected. Hargrove appeared on the screen with the particular look of a man who had made a decision before the call started and was wearing it like a second skin. He was in uniform. His expression was the same as it had been in every interaction Maya had observed, controlled, stripped of register, professionally blank. He looked at the people in the room: Ward, Hayes, Reyes, Kowalski, Faro off to the side. Then his eyes landed on Maya. She watched what happened in his face in that moment, the infinitesimal tightening around his eyes, the half-second recalibration of everything he'd been prepared to say. Small. Another person might have missed it. She'd been reading faces across rifle scopes for long enough that she caught it. He recovered quickly. That was the training. You recovered quickly, and you kept moving, and you didn't let the surprise become visible. "Captain Ward," he said, "I understand we had 2 successful interdictions yesterday." "That's correct, sir," Ward said. "I've reviewed the preliminary reports. Karimi elimination and the Sherdal node." A pause. "There were some deviations from the planned operational parameters." "There were," Ward said. "Sergeant Voss can speak to those directly." Hargrove looked at Maya. The blankness in his expression was professional and complete, and she could see the calculation running behind it. "Sergeant Voss," he said, "walk me through the deviations from the Overwatch positions." She looked at him on the screen. She thought about the prepared hide chipped into the rock in Sherdal. She thought about the night shot at 1,160 meters, with a 0 she'd confirmed once. She thought about a convoy rolling toward a kill zone in the dark. "The survey recommended positions were compromised," she said. "I identified prepared hides at both recommended sites and selected alternative positions." The silence on the other end of the call lasted 1 second longer than a normal processing pause. "Compromised how?" he asked. "Tool marks on the rock at the recommended position in Sherdal. Deliberate preparation of the depression. Someone had been there before the survey recommended it." She kept her voice even. Kandahar position showed similar indicators on review. "I didn't use either." Another pause, slightly longer. "That's a significant claim about the integrity of the survey team," Hargrove said. "Verispan has a multi-year operational relationship with." "We're aware of the Verispan relationship," Ward said. "We're also aware of the financial relationship between Verispan's institutional access and an account structure that the domestic counterintelligence team flagged 48 hours ago." The blankness on Hargrove's face didn't crack, but it calcified. It became the blankness of something that was holding itself in place by force rather than by ease. "I'm going to need that claim in writing, Captain," he said. "You'll have it," Ward said, "along with the financial trace documentation that the IG's office received this morning." Hargrove looked at Maya again. She held his gaze. She wasn't performing steadiness. She wasn't performing anything. She was just looking at him across the distance of a video connection in a forward operating base in Kandahar province. With the drag bag on the floor behind her and the cut on her knee and 3 hours of sleep in the last 40, and she was letting him see exactly what she was. Not the thin file, not the tactical instructor, not the expendable addition to a unit that had been set up to lose her. The thing her father had spent 14 years becoming, and another 20 building into her, one lessons at a time, on a Montana hillside that smelled like sage and cold dirt. Hargrove ended the call. Not gradually. The screen went dark, without preamble, without the formal close of a military video conference, which was its own kind of information. The room held the blank screen for a moment. Then, Solis, from beside the terminal, said, "Domestic team has him. He's not going anywhere." Maya looked at the dark screen for another second. Then she looked away. Ward was watching her. The recognition in his face had settled into something permanent now, the kind of assessment that doesn't revise itself because it doesn't need to. He'd seen what he'd needed to see. He'd arrived at wherever he was going to land on the question of who she was, and he was there, and it was done. "You need to sleep," he said. "I know," she said. She stood up. Picked up nothing, because she'd brought nothing into the room. She walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard Kowalski say to nobody in particular, in the flat, appraising tone he used when he'd concluded something, 99th percentile. She walked through the door and into the corridor and toward the room with the cot. Outside, the Kandahar Mountains were catching the early morning light in a way that made them look, briefly, like they were made of something warmer than rock. She didn't see it. She was already past the window, walking with her head down and her hands still, thinking about a Sunday morning on a back porch in Montana and a man who had looked at mountains the way she was not looking at these ones, and who had known, with the certainty of someone who'd learned things the hard way, that the skills were the skills, regardless of what you did with them. She lay down on the cot. She was asleep before she could finish the thought she'd started. She slept for 9 hours and woke up to silence. Not the operational silence of a facility holding its breath between actions, actual quiet. Kind that meant nothing, was actively on fire, and nobody needed her in the next 10 minutes. She lay on the cot for a moment and took inventory the way she always did. The knee, which had stiffened overnight and was going to complain when she stood, the right eye, which had the residual soreness of too many hours behind a scope, the headache that had been building behind her left temple for 2 days and had finally, somewhere in the 9 hours, resolved itself. She sat up. Through the single small window at the top of the wall, the light was afternoon. She'd slept through the morning. She registered that without alarm, because if anything had required her in the morning, someone would have knocked, and nobody had knocked. She found her boots and put them on, and walked to the washroom at the end of the corridor, and stood under a lukewarm shower for 4 minutes, and thought about nothing. That was a skill her father had also tried to teach her, how to be in a moment without the moment being about anything. She'd been bad at it for most of her life. She was getting marginally better. When she came back down the corridor, Hayes was leaning against the wall outside her door. He was not in kit. He was wearing a base layer and cargo pants, and he had a cup of coffee in each hand and the expression of a man who had worked out what he wanted to say and was going to say it regardless of how it landed. She stopped. He held out one of the cups. She took it. "Ward's calling the unit stand down at 1,600, he said. "Investigation protocols. We're being rotated out in 48 hours, pending the IG review." "I heard that was coming. Did you hear the part where the preliminary finding already cleared all Shadow-Tide personnel of knowing involvement in the Hargrove situation?" She hadn't. She looked at him. "Solis pushed a preliminary assessment through this morning," Hayes said. "Fast-tracked. She said it was the cleanest part of the whole situation. Nobody on this team had anything but bad intelligence, and no reason to suspect it." He paused. She made sure that was on record before the IG process formally opened. So it's there from the start instead of having to be proven during. That was her doing that, Maya said. And Ward's? He asked her to. Hayes looked at the coffee cup in his hand. He also filed an addendum to the after-action report on the Kandar operation, specifically about the second shot, the unauthorized engagement. She waited. He removed the protocol violation notation, Hayes said. Reclassified it as within independent action doctrine for precision overwatch. Said the radio loop calculus made prior authorization structurally impossible, which is what you told him and what Reyes confirmed. He paused. Clean. No mark on your record. She thought about that for a moment. What it meant and what it didn't mean. He didn't have to do that, she said. No, Hayes agreed. He didn't. They stood in the corridor with their coffees, and the quiet that existed between people who have been through something together and are on the other side of it, and don't need to perform the having been through it. The Sherdal position, Hayes said. He was looking at the wall across from him. I walked past the prepared hide. You were given a survey that told you the prepared position was the recommended site. You looked at it in that context. I should have seen it anyway. She didn't argue with that because it wouldn't have helped him, and also because it was partly true. He was a good operator, and he'd missed something, and the missing of it had nearly cost the operation. Those things were all simultaneously real. You caught it on the second pass, she said. When you had eyes that weren't oriented by the package. You caught it on the second pass. I was standing next to you. You looked where I was pointing. Yeah. He took a drink of coffee. I did. A pause. That's not nothing, she said. Some people don't look even when you point. He thought about that for a moment. The night shot, he said. 1,160 meters. Digx 0 confirmed once on a reference target. I've been thinking about the probability on that, and I can't get the math to work in a way that makes it feel like it should have worked. Almost didn't, she said. The reference shot was 2 inches left at 11:10. I corrected to 1 inch left based on Reyes's call and the ballistic shift at the longer range, and trusted that the remaining error was within the vital zone threshold. And if it hadn't been, then I'd have missed and we'd have had a different problem. Hayes looked at her. Something in his expression had settled in a way that the prior 3 days hadn't allowed. The argumentative defensiveness gone, replaced by the more complicated thing underneath it, which was the expression of a professional confronting the limits of his own frame of reference. Where'd you learn to hold that kind of calm? He said. Not the technical part, the other part. She thought about Sunday mornings. Cold dirt, a man who looked at mountains without needing them to be anything other than mountains. My father, she said. Hayes nodded slowly. He didn't ask more, which she appreciated. Ward wants to see you at 1,600 before the stand-down briefing, he said. Pushed off the wall. Don't be late. He hates late. He walked away down the corridor. She stood with the coffee and looked at the empty hallway and thought that people were surprising in the directions they surprised you from. She'd expected the obstacle to stay an obstacle. Instead, it had turned into something she didn't have a clean word for. Not friendship. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But something adjacent to respect that had been earned in the uncomfortable way by both of them and would probably hold. At 1,600, she knocked on the frame of Ward's office, a converted storage room with a fold-out desk and 2 chairs and a map on the wall, and nothing personal anywhere, which was either a personality trait or a consequence of rotating deployments, and he probably couldn't tell anymore. Which? Come in. She came in and sat in the chair across from him without waiting to be told. He looked at her for a moment. Then he put down the pen he'd been holding and folded his pen he'd been holding, his hands on the desk. Hargrove is in federal custody as of this morning, he said. Domestic team moved on him at 900. He didn't run. He was at his desk. A pause. Apparently he came into the office, sat down and waited. She thought about that. The image of it. A man at a desk who'd decided somewhere between the end of the video call and the arrival of the federal agents that running was not the version of this he was going to choose. There'll be more coming out of the investigation, Ward continued. The IG team is already looking at other operations that ran off Hargrove's authorization chain over the 26-month window. The Verispan personnel, 2 of them, have been placed on administrative hold. The domestic account holder who warned Hargrove about the financial trace is a paralegal at the law firm. She's been identified and is cooperating. How far does it go? Far enough that the answer to that question is above my clearance level, Ward said. And probably yours. She accepted that. The Karimi Network's domestic funding stream is cut, he said. The Shirtle node is down. The Upper Valley cell that the runner linked up with Faro's signals team picked up a communication indicating they're retreating north. No longer operationally viable in this sector. He paused. None of that is because of one shot. But the first shot started a sequence that got us here. Sequences start somewhere, she said. Yes. He looked at her steadily. I'm submitting a formal commendation. 3 engagements in 30 hours under compromised intelligence conditions. Night precision engagement with a non-standard optic. Independent identification of 2 prepared hostile positions. Material contribution to both primary interdictions and the convoy protection action. He picked up the pen again. Your file's going to look different when this is done. She thought about her father's phone call. The arrangement. Careful erasure of the notation that would have told the right person what they needed to know. He'd done it to protect her from, exactly, this, from being picked up and used and pointed at things, because she was useful. Protection had failed in the direction he'd feared. She'd been picked up anyway, by the wrong person, for the wrong reasons. But the skills had held, the thing he'd actually given her, not the arrangement, not the thin file, but the 14,000 hours of instruction, and the particular way of thinking about wind and distance and patience that had held completely. Make the file accurate, she said. That's all. That's what a commendation is. Then file it. Ward looked at her for a moment more. Then he nodded and made a note. There's a question I need to ask you, he said. And I'm asking it formally, as part of the post-operation personnel assessment. She waited. Red Valley, he said. You want to go back? The question was simple, and was not simple at all. She'd thought about it in the shower. She'd thought about it on the cot in the 9 hours that were supposedly sleep. She'd been thinking about it since the Kandar Ridge line, probably, in the background register, where you think about things that aren't urgent, but are important. Red Valley was classrooms and training fields, and soldiers who needed the lessons she had to give. It was the same building every day. It was the work her father had meant when he'd said the skills were the skills regardless of what you did with them, passing them forward, making the next person better, so that when the next person lay down behind the rifle in a bad situation, they had what they needed rather than what they could scrape together. It was also the place she'd been standing when Hargrove had found her. And the fact of that she'd been findable there, that the thin file hadn't been protection enough, that the arrangement had a ceiling, was something she was going to have to reckon with in a way she hadn't yet. I want to go back eventually, she said. The teaching is real work. It matters, but not immediately. No, she paused. Not immediately. Ward looked at her with the expression she'd finally named recognition and let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke. There's a program, he said. It doesn't have a public designation. Precision integration field deployment for operators with a specific profile cross-attached to special mission units on a case-by-case basis. It's not a permanent assignment. It's a list. He paused. You'd continue at Red Valley. You'd be available when the list calls. Who runs the program? It rotates. Currently a colonel at JSOC, whose office I trust. He looked at her carefully. The vetting for the list is different from standard assignment channel. Your file doesn't get touched by anyone in Hargrove's former authorization chain. She understood what he was telling her. The arrangement her father had tried to build had failed because it relied on the wrong architecture, on obscurity, rather than on the right people knowing the right things. Or was offering a different architecture, one where the knowledge existed in the correct hands rather than being concealed from all hands. Her father would have argued with that. Her father would have argued with that. She could hear him arguing with it, patient and specific, from the back porch or the bench or the kitchen table, with the half-loaded magazine in front of him. She'd thought for a long time that he was right. Now, she thought he'd been right for the wrong reasons, or right in a context that no longer applied, or right in the way that people are right when they're building a protection from the inside of a grief that doesn't have a clean solution. He'd lost people. She knew that without knowing the specifics. The 14 years in the unit, with no public designation, you didn't walk away from that without loss, and you didn't build the careful life he'd built on the Montana land without something to protect against. The thin file was love, in the architecture that he knew how to build love in. Functional, load-bearing, not beautiful. She missed him in the way that arrives sideways, and without warning when you've been too operational to feel it directly, a sudden awareness of the specific weight of his absence. Not the grief itself, but the shape that the grief makes in the space where the person used to be. "I'll go on the list," she said. Ward nodded once. "Stand-down briefing is in 30 minutes, he said. "After that, you're on a transport back to Red Valley in 22 hours. He paused. "There's something else." She waited. He reached into the folder on his desk and produced a single printed sheet, a personnel commendation form, partially completed in his handwriting, with her name and service number at the top. He turned it so she could read it. She read it. The language was formal and precise, and said, in the controlled vocabulary of military documentation, exactly what had happened, and exactly what it had taken, and exactly what it had meant for the personnel involved. It named the night shot at 1,160 meters. It named the identification of the prepared hide. It named the convoy protection action. It also named, in the section for additional context, the circumstances of her assignment, that she had been placed on the operation under false pretenses by a superior officer whose motivations were under active investigation, and that her performance had occurred in conditions that were hostile, not only in the conventional sense, but in the institutional sense as well, and that the distinction was material to understanding what the performance represented. She looked at that paragraph for a moment. "You didn't have to include that part," she said. "The record should be accurate," he said. "That's what you told me." She looked at him. He looked back. She set the form down on his desk. "File it," she said. The stand-down briefing was in the main bay at 1,630. All 7 Shadowtide personnel, Mercer, Faro, and Solis, standing in this loose semicircle around Ward, because there weren't enough chairs, and nobody had suggested getting more. Ward spoke for 11 minutes. He covered the investigation timeline, the rotation schedule, the IG process, and what it meant practically for each person in the room. He answered 3 questions from Kowalski, 1 from Hayes, and 1 from Faro. He did not perform optimism or gravity. He delivered information in the same flat, precise register he used for everything, which was the most honest way to do it. When he was done, he said, "Dismissed. Get some food." People moved. Kowalski disappeared toward the mess facility, with the focused intention of a man who had identified his next objective. Faro went back to his terminal. Reyes and the other operators filtered out in pairs, talking in the low, compressed way of people processing a transition. Solis stopped beside Maya on her way out. "The preliminary assessment that cleared Shadowtide," Maya said. "Thank you." Solis looked at her with the calm dark eyes. "Accurate assessment," she said. It was also fast. Fast and accurate aren't mutually exclusive. She paused. "Your father's training record, the unit he served with. It'll come up in the investigation as context for the Hargrove targeting rationale. I wanted you to know before it's a document somewhere." Maya looked at her. What happens to it? It gets classified appropriately and placed in a file that the relevant oversight personnel can access. It doesn't go anywhere public. Solis paused again. Served well. The record reflects that, for people who can read it. She hadn't expected that. She sat with it for a moment, the idea of her father's 14 years is becoming legible to someone, somewhere, in a document that could be accessed by people who needed to know what it contained. It wasn't public recognition. It was more specific than that, and more honest, and probably more suited to what he'd actually done and who he'd actually been. She thought he would have hated it, and, also underneath the hating, accepted it as correct. "Thank you," she said. Solis nodded once and walked out. The mess facility at FAB Kestrel had 4 tables, fluorescent lighting that flickered slightly on the left side, and food that was adequate in the way that military food is adequate. It solved the problem it was designed to solve without pretending to do more. Maya ate alone at the table by the window, which looked out at the vehicle bay, and, beyond it, the perimeter fence and the mountains behind that. Reyes sat down across from her at some point. He had a tray, and he put it down and sat for a while without talking, which was the appropriate approach. After a while, he said, "You going back to Red Valley?" "Good." He ate another bite. "Teaching is underrated." She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "The shot I called on the western slope, the 1-inch left with the ballistic correction, I learned that in a classroom. From an instructor who spent 45 minutes on a problem that I thought was theoretical." He paused. It wasn't theoretical. She thought about the classroom. Particular patience required to stand in front of people who were learning something and hold the knowledge carefully enough, Kassad, it transferred, rather than just being demonstrated. Her father had that patience. She'd inherited some version of it, though hers was less graceful and more direct, and occasionally got mistaken for impatience. "Who was the instructor?" she asked. Reyes looked at her. "Someone whose file, I bet, looked pretty ordinary." She looked back at him. He went back to eating. 22 hours later, she was on a transport that smelled like hydraulic fluid and cold metal, and the accumulated exhaustion of a cargo manifest that had been moving personnel and equipment in and out of forward positions for longer than any of the seats had been designed to handle. She had the MK-21 in the drag bag between her boots. It was going back to the armory at Red Valley, where it would be logged in and cleaned and stored and eventually signed out again by someone with a qualification score high enough to warrant it, and a mission that required it. She had a folder in her pack, printed copies of the commendation form and the preliminary personnel assessment. Not because she needed them for anything specific, because accuracy was accuracy and it was worth carrying. She had a cut on her left knee that was healing in the slightly crooked way that cuts heal when and rather been taped than properly sutured, and it was going to leave a small scar that would be visible in certain lighting for probably the rest of her life. She had 3 days in Kandar province behind her and an accurate file ahead of her and a list cover and a list with her name on it, somewhere in a JSOC office where the right people knew what the name meant. She looked out the small window at the mountains below. Kandar range at altitude in the early morning light, with cloud systems moving through the valleys and the high peaks catching the first direct sun in a way that made them look briefly like something on fire. Her father would have looked at that for a long time. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about what he'd said on the back porch, the night before she'd left for her enlistment. She'd been 22. He'd been 61 and already showing the first signs of the cardiac issue that would take him 8 years later, though neither of them knew that yet. They'd sat outside in the cold with coffee and not talked much, which was their preferred mode. At some point he'd said, the thing about preparation is that you can't always see what you're preparing for. You just have to trust that the work is going somewhere. She'd said, what if it doesn't go anywhere? He'd thought about that with the particular patience he applied to questions that deserved patience. Then you'd look better at the thing than if you hadn't done the work, he'd said. And that's not nothing. That's usually enough. She'd thought he was being philosophical in the oblique way he sometimes was, and she'd let it sit and moved on. She understood it differently now. Not more deeply, necessarily. He'd meant what he'd said, and it was a complete thought, but more personally. She understood it the way you understand things that have been demonstrated rather than explained, through the experience of lying in the dirt on a dark slope in a country her father had never visited, with a rifle he'd never touched and an optic he'd never approved of, building a firing solution from observation and instinct, and the accumulated weight of 14,000 hours of instruction that had never once announced itself as preparation for this exact moment. Transport banked west in the mountains disappeared from the window, turned back to the interior of the aircraft, and closed her eyes. Red Valley Air Command Center looked the same. The same parking lot, the same entry gate with the same 2 guards who'd seen her come and go for 6 years and nodded the same nod. The same administrative building with the same fluorescent corridor that led to the same classrooms where the same kind of soldiers were learning things they didn't yet know they'd need. She checked the MK-21 back into the armory on her first afternoon. The armorer, a young specialist named Torres, who'd been there a year and had good instincts and a qualification score that was going to keep climbing, signed the rifle back in with the careful attention that good armorers paid to equipment that had been out in the field. "How was it?" Torres asked. "Cold," Maya said. Torres looked at the rifle, then at the drag bag, then at her, in the particular way that young soldiers look at people who've come back from something when they haven't been yet. "Everything worked the way it's supposed to," he said. She thought about that for a moment. "Yes," she said. Eventually, she went to her office. It was a small room with a window that faced the training range, and on a good day she could see the targets at the 600-meter line from her desk if the light was right. She'd requested the office specifically for that reason. She sat down. On her desk was a stack of qualification assessments she'd been behind on before Hargrove's summons. Student files, scores, observations, recommended training modifications. The ordinary documentation of the ordinary work. She picked up the top file. The student was a 24-year-old specialist from Georgia with a natural trigger discipline that was above average and a wind reading deficiency that was going to plateau him at medium range if it wasn't addressed in the next 2 months. She'd noted the deficiency before she left. She looked at the most recent range scores and confirmed it was still there. She made a note in the margin, a specific note, the kind that would require a specific conversation, not a general correction, but a targeted session with a particular drill sequence she'd developed for exactly this gap. She'd been refining the drill for 2 years. It worked about 70% of the time. In the 30% it didn't work on, she'd been analyzing separately. She moved to the next file. Her phone was on the corner of the desk, and at some point it buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it. List is active. First call likely, 6 to 8 weeks. W. Ward. She hadn't had his personal contact before. He'd apparently decided that was a solvable problem. She looked at the message for a moment. Then she set the phone face down on the desk and went back to the student files. Outside the window, the training range was in use a line of soldiers at the 500-meter position, working a drill she'd designed 18 months ago for a problem she'd identified in the way Red Valley was teaching wind holds at medium range. She could see the instructors moving behind the line, making corrections, resetting targets. One of the students wasn't compensating enough on the right side. She could see it from here, the pattern of strikes drifting left on a right-to-left crosswind, consistent across 3 shots, which meant it was technique and not noise. She made a note to catch the student after the range session. She went back to the files. The work was unglamorous and specific, and required the particular kind of patience that operated without recognitions, not the patience of waiting for a moment, but the patience of building toward moments you might not be present for, of making someone better at something so that somewhere down the line, in a valley you'd never see, in conditions you couldn't predict, they had what they needed when it counted. Her father had understood that. He'd spent 20 years of his life practicing it in a Montana town with a daughter who had, for most of her life, thought he was just a rancher who was good with a rifle. She understood it now in the way that things become clear when you've been on the other end of them, when you've been the person who needed the preparation that someone else had the patience to provide. She worked through the afternoon. When the light through the range window went orange and the training day ended and the last of the students cleared the line, she set the final file down and sat for a moment in the quiet office with her hands flat on the desk. Steady. She looked at that for a moment. The steadiness. The same inventory she'd been running since Kandar, since the western slope, since the first shot across the valley, that had made 6 men go silent. Still there. Still working. She stood up. She put the files in order. She turned off the desk light. She walked out of the office and down the corridor and out through the main door into the evening air, which was cold and smelled like cut grass and gunpowder residue, and the specific combination of metal and earth that was the permanent background of a working range. She stood outside for a moment and looked at the mountains on the horizon, smaller than the Kandar range, gentler, but mountains, the same way, indifferent and large and entirely unconcerned. She'd started to understand that indifference differently, not as absence, but as a kind of honesty. The mountains didn't need you to be exceptional. They didn't need you to be anything. They were just there, and the work you brought to them was yours, and what you made of the work was also yours, and no external recognition added to it or subtracted from it. Skills were the skills regardless of what you did with them. She'd been told that once, by someone who understood it completely, on a back porch in Montana, in the cold, with coffee that had gone mostly cold, and she'd heard it, but she hadn't understood it, and now she did. She walked to her car. She drove home. The mountains on the horizon stayed where they were. The greatest things people carry are rarely the things anyone can see. Prepare well. Do the work. Be where you're needed, not where you're expected.